Good morning, all. I want to welcome you to this workshop, which is another in our series in connection with our quadrennial review of our media ownership rules. Today's workshop will focus on the intersection between our media ownership rules and our policies in favor of diversity of ownership in broadcast. We have two distinguished panels today, but I'm delighted to say that we will start off with some welcoming remarks from Commissioner Clyburn.
Thank you, Mr. Lake. Good morning, everyone. Oh, wow, the word got out. Thank you. I appreciate it. We have issues of the utmost importance to examine this morning, so I'll be brief. I am so very much looking forward to the presentations and discussions by these esteemed panelists and some of the challenges we face to increase the number of women and minority owners in the broadcast industry. The Commission has fought to improve the dismal state of minority and female ownership in this arena, only to see faint progress along the way. Despite all our efforts to date, we must do better, and nothing else will suffice. As our first panel today will undoubtedly discuss, there are formidable roadblocks in our path to a diverse and truly vibrant media market. The legal landscape has only become more foreboding over time, leaving us with limited options to create an environment conducive to minority and female ownership. But what I ask of today's panelists, as well as of my colleagues here at the Commission, is that we persevere in the face of this steep uphill climb. Our goal is far too essential for us to yield. Let's put our heads together in order to create a record or design regulations that convey to the courts what we so clearly see as a compelling government interest and find innovative ways to narrowly tailor our rules to achieve our worthy ends. My friends, there is no stricter scrutiny than how we view ourselves at the end of every day. We are measured as public servants by what we can deliver to the American people, and I believe that if we are thoughtful, thorough, and collaborative in our work, we can break through this unfortunate logjam that has left our nation's promise unfulfilled. I pledge to you my full support to all of you in this endeavor, and if my office can be of any assistance to you, please do not hesitate to let us know. Thank you, panelists, for sacrificing your time and for your commitment and for the commitment of all of those in the audience to not think it robbery to be here today. I look forward to working with you to make a meaningful and a positive, most significantly a lasting impact. Thank you and good morning.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Clyburn. Those thoughts will guide us through the morning. We have two very distinguished panels as parts of today's workshop. The first will be representatives of the academic community, and the second, broadcasters and media advocacy groups. I would like to just point out that we're being live webcast and recorded, so I'll ask all the speakers to get close to their microphones so we have good reception. And we will be taking questions both from those who are present in person and from those who are in the webcast audience. I will now turn it over to Jake Lewis, who is our acting Deputy General Counsel, who will moderate the first panel.
Thank you, Bill. The first panelist is Professor Leonard Baines. Leonard Baines is a professor of law and the inaugural director of the Ronald H. Brown Center for Civil Rights and Economic Development at St. John's University Law School. He teaches business organizations, communications law, regulated industries, and race in the law. Professor Baines received his BS from New York University and a JD MBA from Columbia University. Amongst his many achievements, from 1997 to 2001, Professor Baines was hired by then FCC Chairman William Kennard to serve as a scholar in residence at the FCC, where he was responsible for access, opportunity, and ownership issues. Professor Baines.
Thank you so much for inviting me here on this very, very important topic. And I have PowerPoint slides which I plan to show. Let's see if we can get them up and running. And what I plan to do today are two things in the time I have allotted. One is to sort of talk about sort of a lot of people say, well, the internet, broadband, they cure all of these issues. And one of the things I think that we need to think about is the fact that, well, that's one thing, is that the broadband and internet, one of the things you have to ask, is it the same market? Is it really a substitute for broadcast? That's one issue. And the second thing I want to talk about is sort of the studies that we had worked on while I was here at the FCC dealing with broadcast ownership and the FCC's passive complicity in terms of the discrimination in the market that took place. So let me begin with the PowerPoint slides. So under the antitrust analysis, one of the things you need to look for in terms of determining whether broadcast and internet and broadband are the same market is whether it's sort of, can you substitute between them? Are there distinct customers? Are there distinct prices? Is the sensitivity to price changes, specialized vendors? And do we see them as different markets? And when you look at sort of the viewing patterns and the listening patterns of people of color with respect to radio and TV, you see that generally it's different. And the other thing we have to look at is sort of access to internet and broadband and the fact that there still is a digital divide. And so let's look at some of the data. I'm trying to get to the next slide. So the other thing about the broadband internet is that we have to think about the fact that it is not free, whereas broadcast TV tends to be. There's still a digital divide between African Americans and Latinos, and that as a source of information, many people go to the same affiliated sites of the major broadcast stations and cable stations. If we look at the this recent Pew study, it shows that there's been increasing usage of the internet by all population groups, but we still see there's a disparity between African Americans, Hispanics, and whites, and we see that not everybody's still using the internet, and this is internet usage from every location. If you look at broadband usage in the home broadband, you see much more of a disparity, and you still see Hispanics especially being particularly underserved. And so the question is, if we are going to say, well, let's use the internet and broadband to sort of cure all the problems and everybody has access to everything, well, some people don't, and a large percentage of people of color do not. And so the question is, broadband, given the broadcast, given the fact that it's in 99% of individuals' homes, and internet and broadband is still not, it's not a substitute. This is another part of the Pew study which shows that 55% of Americans are connected to the internet wirelessly, 83% of the Americans have cell phones, and only 35% of cell phone users actually access the internet through their cell phones. So in terms of remote devices, access to internet through not at your home, there's still a disparity and there's still underusage, and it's still not going to cure the problems of with respect to broadcast access to replace it. Now, this looks at sort of where there is some sort of difference, where African Americans and Latinos actually outperform whites, and this is sort of use of the internet with respect to wireless access to get access to the internet. So those African Americans and Latinos that actually use the internet wirelessly actually outperform whites with respect to access of data through remote devices. The last election, there was all this conversation about the fact that the internet has sort of changed everything, and there was all this participation, et cetera. The Pew study showed that there really was a lot of involvement in the population, but that the internet basically, you had to be affluent or well-educated really to use it. That's where the growth was. So that it reaffirmed a lot of the statistics that we have with respect to disengagement or lack of use by people of color as opposed to whites in terms of comparison. And when the Pew study looks at this, where the people of color were very much involved in offline communication, it was almost similar if you look at blacks and whites in terms of the political participation, but when you look at online communication, you still see a disparity between blacks and whites. And the Latinos that they surveyed, it was too few in number to actually give a percentage. For social media, such as Facebook, et cetera, what you find is that the Pew study said that, yeah, there's been a great increase in growth by those under 35, in terms of political participation, civic participation, et cetera. But what you find is that there's still a gap. It may be a closed gap between those who are affluent and educated and those who are not. So I think the difference is that what we see is with respect to broadcasting is that broadcasting is really fairly ubiquitous. But what we have in terms of what is coverage is that there's sensationalism in terms of the coverage, focus on conflicts. They often don't cover the issues that really affect people's lives. And let me skip to sort of the studies that we worked on. So what we look at with respect to the studies that the FCC had conducted during the late 90s that were released in 2001, one of the important things I think to take note of is that even though we had comparative hearing process to distribute licenses, most licenses actually were distributed through singleton process. Over 6,000 licenses were distributed through not a comparative hearing, where there was only one applicant. And only the comparative hearings had preferences or enhanced consideration for people of minority backgrounds. And so that's important because what you find with the study, so let me skip forward, is that 74% of non-minority initial applicants never competed in a comparative hearing, whereas 35% of minority initial applicants never competed in comparative hearings. So what this shows, this is an important point, is that non-minorities were more likely to get licenses through a singleton process where there was no competition, where there was no affirmative action process, whereas for minorities that was less likely, much less likely. So if you were a non-minority, the chance of getting a license were much greater because there was no competition. And in fact, what would happen is that even though you had minority enhancements, you'd have more people going after the initial minority applicant. So as a result, this was a study by that we had conducted, showed that the minorities and non-minorities, even if you take all this into account, basically had almost a similar rate of getting the license, 45% versus 44%. And what also happened is that you often had more minorities actually participating in the process through the comparative hearing process. The number of minorities actually increased. So 3.7 on average versus 3.2 for non-minorities. For minorities versus women versus non-minorities, you see also this increase with respect to the number of minorities and women in terms of the number of applicants. And part of this was a way for non-minorities probably to game the comparative hearing process. And there's sort of other examples of this. But when it came to actually who got the licenses, those applicants that actually were minority owned really did really worse than those that had minority participation, which showed that there were a lot of minority applicants that were probably being used as fronts. The studies also show that, in terms of loans, which are sort of the lifeblood in terms of getting the licenses, that there was capital market discrimination in terms of interest rate amounts, getting the loans themselves, et cetera. Minority borrowers paid higher interest rates, et cetera. There was also advertising discrimination in terms of no urban, no Spanish dictates, minority discounts. I saw Kathy Sandoval in the audience who was working on that. I saw her somewhere. Hi, Kathy. And so as a result, KPMG, which did the study, found that there was a lower overall probability of minorities actually getting a license, a winning license, than non-minorities, even despite the fact that you had these minority enhancements during this process. And as a result, one of the issues you have here is that you have to look at what the standard is for review. And one of the issues that you have in the Croson case is that if you distribute licenses in an industry or a market that might be discriminatory, and you realize that you're doing that, the FCC may be passively complicit in that discrimination. And that's something I think the FCC needs to take into account, because it's been many, many years before the FCC has actually had minority ownership policies. And the question is, and this is my final, I know I'm sort of running on time, but to sum it up, is that you're never going to have a perfect solution. The FCC really needs to just get off the dime, because if they're looking for a silver bullet, we'll never really know, because the problem is that there have been no cases since Metro Broadcasting, which there's now a different standard of review, and we'll never know until there's a case that's actually brought. And so what I challenge the FCC to do is to think about creative ways to make sure that minorities actually are able to fully participate in the broadcast industry. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Baines. I see, Bill, that Commissioner McDowell is now here in the room, so perhaps we can divert to him.
Yes, welcome. We'd welcome some remarks from you.
Thanks so much. Sorry for being late. Traffic. What can I say? For those of you who are natives, know what I'm talking about. It's awful. And I'll condense this because I hate interrupting and I didn't want to disrupt. So I first of all appreciate everyone being here today, everyone else who was able to make it on time. So I really welcome everyone's thoughts on what the Commission can do to promote opportunities for minorities and women through our media ownership rules, as well as any ownership-related initiatives that you may be exploring. As many of you know, I've been an active supporter of the Commission's recent efforts to support new and existing minority broadcasters, including, I heard mentioned earlier, the ban on discrimination in advertising, the so-called No Urban, No Spanish dictates, which is very, very key, I think, and relaxing certain attribution rules to encourage greater investment in licensees controlled by small businesses, small business eligible entities, including those owned by women and people of color. Throughout my time as a commissioner, I've called for a greater awareness of the financial realities that face small enterprises and new entrants, of course, including minorities and women. Changes in our ownership rules alone, though, I think as was already said, won't achieve much it won't achieve much if the intended beneficiaries can't obtain the financing they need to make their aspirations a reality. A very important color in all of this equation is the color green, of course. Now, while the government cannot address all aspects of the situation, I favor taking action when we have a good legal and factual basis for doing so. So, for example, for some time now, I've urged that the Commission offer active assistance to Congress in fashioning a legally sustainable tax certificate program to promote ownership of communications companies by economically disadvantaged businesses. And I'd like to get your reactions and advice on this concept in particular. And I've been calling for that for several years now. Similarly, I wonder where there may be some small silver lining in the current economic situation that we find our country in, but especially for broadcasters. So deconsolidation as a result seems to be the current trend among some of the largest station group owners. And that actually may in turn offer up some new opportunities for small entities and new entrants coming into the business for the first time. So if panelists today and going forward have any suggestions in that regard, I would be very, very interested in hearing them. So let's make some really tasty lemonade maybe out of the economic lemons we've been handed here recently. Finally, I know that this panel will take on the most critical component of any future effort to craft race-conscious ownership rules, the substantial hurdles that the Commission or any government agency faces to satisfy the demands of the Due Process Clause as set forth under the Supreme Court's Adarand decision. So I'd like to say this over and over, whether it's in this context or another context. I really like to be upheld in court, and so I think it can actually be counterproductive to take a step forward, but only to be knocked back several steps by the courts. So let's measure twice and cut once and make sure what we do actually might be upheld on appeal. I think that's very, very important. So in any case, I look forward to the dialogue as it progresses today and hereafter, and as it has been progressing over the years. I know Rosemary Harold will be here, my legal advisor for all things media, will be here to monitor this panel in more depth, as I've got a very busy morning ahead of me, unfortunately. But thank you all very, very much, and I will be monitoring everything you say and hear with great interest. Thank you again.
Thank you, Commissioner McDowell. Our next panelist is Carolyn Byerly. Dr. Byerly is a member of the Department of Journalism and graduate faculty member, Mass Communication and Mass Studies program at Howard University. She is also a co-founder and participant in the Howard Media Group, a collaboration among communication scholars involved in applied research and other activities that have the goals of expanding race and gender equality in media industries. She is the co-author, among other things, of Women in Media, A Critical Introduction, and the co-editor of Women in Media, International Perspectives. Welcome, Dr. Byerly.
Good morning. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you this morning, especially since I seem to be the only non-attorney in the lineup here. I'm not quite sure how that happened, except my colleagues and I keep company at a lot of these kinds of events. My training is in social science research. For 2 decades, I've been concerned with examining the dynamic relationship of women and people of color to the news and other media. With me today are, or soon will be, I hope, in the audience, 2 of my colleagues, Reggie Miles and Dr. Yang Jin Park. We are part of the Howard Media Group that our colleague down the table here mentioned. And the remarks that I'll share today represent our shared thinking. We will leave it for our scholars today, the legal scholars, to speak to the finer points of the law as regards the policy. And what I would like to do is try and map out some broader social science type themes that represent the kind of research we believe needs to be done so that the Commission has all of the facts that it needs to consider women and minority ownership. Media ownership in the United States today divides along the historic fault lines of gender and race. The low single-digit ownership rates for women and people of color in broadcast say quite loudly that the nation is faced with both a women's rights and a civil rights crisis in policy. The seriousness of the situation must be understood within the context of a nation moving rapidly toward racial and ethnic plurality with nobody having a majority. The media today do not and cannot serve the public interest as long as the skewed media ownership pattern continues, and the situation could actually worsen without policy changes. We suggest several studies that believe will help the Commission to consider both the impact of these policies, the present policies that is, as well as possible remedies. The first is we believe that there needs to be research to establish the impact of deregulation on the loss of minority-related public affairs programming and the impact of such loss on minority communities. First is the matter of how Black and other minority communities are affected by declining numbers of stations under the ownership of those in their own communities. Scholars like Oberholzer G. and Walfogel have found that there are higher voting rates in communities where there are ethnically owned radio stations. Squires found that African Americans in Chicago trusted information from Black-owned stations more than they did those of white ownership. Byerly, myself, and 2 of my colleagues found similar statements from African American participants in our research in the Washington, D.C. area. These, my own and others researchers say, their participants say that Black-owned stations tell us the truth, they're more trustworthy, and that white majority stations don't really understand our issues, and that reporters only come into our communities when something bad happens. My colleagues and I are concerned about the decline of local news and public affairs, programming and broadcast, a phenomenon that the work of Lawrence Redd in 1991 showed is the outgrowth of deregulation. Redd's early work found that the Black community, the loss of news and public service announcements lessened the amount of important information about local health, safety, well-being, and its availability to Black families who use that information. In reconsidering ownership with respect to minorities, we suggest taking Redd's research as a starting point and commissioning a two-part study that would compare the amount of news and public affairs programming before and since the Telecom Act of 1996, and then using those findings to determine the more specific impact on the minority populations today. Such a study would employ a mixed methodology of quantitative analysis and targeted audience research. Number two, we believe there needs to be research to establish clear criteria for determining public interest in relation to minority communities. The matter of defining the public interest goes back to 1960 when the FCC adopted a report and statement of policy regarding a commission en banc program inquiry, popularly referred to as the 1960 Program Policy Statement. That policy statement included a set of 14 criteria for determining whether the public interest, necessity, and convenience were being served by broadcast stations. The 1960 statement also concluded that broadcasters should determine the tastes, needs, and desires of the community and decide programming to meet those needs. The FCC was thus led to the adoption of formal ascertainment requirements, which compelled applicants for broadcast licenses to detail the results of the interviews conducted by the applicant with community leaders. The Commission later abandoned those 14 criteria and then eliminated the requirement further that stations even keep program logs and the kind of information that would be used by community groups to determine whether their issues were being covered. The lack of specific standards, together with the lack of documentation available to stations' performance, was worsened by the effects of conglomeration and the accompaniment of which accompanied the Telecom Act of 1996. We believe the homogenization of program content, which emanates from national and regional headquarters, has virtually no concrete way for such content to be evaluated in relation to public interest. We advocate returning to a defined set of standards for public interest, which arises from the development of markers that measure what the public says it needs for well-being and it's to meet its own needs. We recommend refining, replicating, and updating the study that I did with two of my colleagues, Langmia and Cupid, in 2006, conducted in Washington, D.C. neighborhoods. We believe the study, which was essentially an audience ethnographic study, could be replicated in communities across the country to better determine what people say they need from their local broadcast stations. Number three, we believe there needs to be research to determine market entry barriers to women's ownership and ways that gender enters into programming for local community needs and interests. Women's nearly non-existent ownership. It's hard to tell what that portends for 51% of the population. Women historically came to own stations through inheritance from their fathers or husbands and through family partnerships. The Form 323 filings show that women own approximately 5% of the television stations and 6% of the radio stations, slightly more than ownership for racial minorities. I should note as well that women of color own less than 1% of these stations, a frightening statistic given the approach to population parity between white and non-white people in the nation. It is well established in the literature that women's programming needs are underserved. Concerned about women's declining ownership in broadcast, I recently undertook a study that will soon be published in which I surveyed women owners about their experience in ownership and interviewed an additional group of experts on their assessment of issues in ownership and gender. My research found that women face discrimination in acquiring and operating broadcast stations, what the FCC has framed as market entry barriers. As we know, women's ownership is concentrated in rural areas, where they also have difficulty obtaining financing and selling of advertising. These factors virtually assure they will operate with marginal income and that they will eventually fail or operate on a margin, a very small margin. Women owners actively involved in running their stations, however, describe a strong commitment to community service, to hiring staff with a community orientation. One woman identified her greatest achievement in community service in relation to staying, what she called, quote, staying true to her ethnic community. She said, "My common bond is my ethnic Hispanic heritage. There is an energy and passion driven by making a spot commercial and then seeing that business grow after they have advertised with us." Another woman said, I have been able to add more educational programs through grants, by partnering with nonprofit organizations, and by adding more ethnic groups to our programming. Recent research by Sandoval cites scholarship showing that minority broadcast owners are very involved in their station's programming and operations. And as I noted earlier, communities benefit from such involvement. In the case of minorities, it's been shown that there's a stronger voter turnout, for instance. If women were similarly involved in their stations, the 23 owners and 17 experts in my study indicate there may indeed be more programming with women's needs, interests, and perspectives in mind. My research suggests a need for further exploration as to how and under what circumstances women's ownership of broadcast stations affects programming content and service to the local community, and whether the FCC should do more to promote local ownership and direct involvement by those female owners in station operations. I look forward to talking to you more about these suggestions.
Thank you, Dr. Byerly. Our next panelist is Professor Angela Campbell. Professor Campbell directs the Institute for Public Representation, a public interest law firm and clinical program at Georgetown Law School. She represents nonprofit organizations seeking adoption and enforcement of media policies in the public interest in such areas as children's television and advertising, media ownership limits, public interest obligations for broadcast stations, and increasing employment and ownership opportunities for minority and women in the media. In that capacity, she's very familiar with the members of the FCC's Office of General Counsel, including myself. We welcome Professor Campbell.
Thanks, Jake. I thank the Media Bureau for holding this workshop and for asking some very important questions. Unfortunately, there are not a lot of easy answers here. One of the problems is the paucity of the case law that Len referred to. We only have 2 cases that directly address the FCC's licensing of broadcast stations. The 1990 Supreme Court decision in Metro Broadcasting, in fact, upheld 2 FCC policies that were designed to promote minority ownership. One of these was the consideration of race as one of many factors in the comparative hearing process, and the other was the FCC's distress sale policy, which allowed owners of or licensees who had been designated for hearing and were at risk of losing their license to transfer to a qualified minority buyer at a less than fair market value. The court applied intermediate scrutiny and found that these policies were constitutional. But subsequently, in the Adarand decision, the Supreme Court decided that the correct standard for federal government policies that took into account race was strict scrutiny. Since the Metro Broadcasting Court only evaluated the evidence under intermediate scrutiny, it really just didn't address whether these policies could pass strict scrutiny. Then we had the 1992 decision of the D.C. Circuit in the Lamprecht case, and this was a challenge to the policy of considering gender as one of many factors in awarding new broadcast licenses. And this policy was applied for the first time in the context of a specific comparative hearing where the FCC decided that women should get some preference, but not as much as minorities if they were going to be working at the station in a management capacity. Again, the court applied strict scrutiny, and it found that the FCC had failed to establish even a substantial governmental interest in increasing female ownership. But in fact, the FCC really did not have a factual record. They really hadn't tried to make a factual record. They had just analogized women to minorities, and so they haven't really tried, even though they had the opportunity on remand to build a record that would support intermediate scrutiny for women, which, by the way, is still the standard for gender preferences. So neither of these cases really provide much guidance to the Commission as to what's necessary to meet the guarantees of equal protection. And the other cases, which typically involve things like government contracts, employment, and university admissions, don't provide much guidance because they rise in such vastly different contexts. So I think the most we can really say about these cases is that we know that strict scrutiny is going to apply where race is a factor, and that intermediate scrutiny will apply where gender is a factor. Now, under strict scrutiny, and I'm going to focus on that here, is that The FCC would have to show that the race-based measure serves a compelling governmental interest and it's narrowly tailored to achieve that interest. This test can be applied only to specific policies or proposals in the context of the record that's actually developed by the Commission. In other words, you can't just decide these issues in the abstract whether or not it's going to be constitutional. The FCC has to identify the interest, support that interest exists, and that that their proposal or their policy actually achieves that interest, and that it's narrowly tailored to do so. So I'm going to assume that the FCC, I believe that the FCC in fact could show that there's compelling governmental interest on either grounds of diversity or past discrimination. And I think some of the other panelists are going to address that point in more detail. But I want to make the point that, you have to, you really should start, well, I'm not saying start, you have to do both, but we want to look at the narrowly tailoring side, because even if you have a compelling governmental interest, it still has to be narrowly tailoring, and it has to narrowly tailored, and it has to be effective. So, for example, I think that you could argue under the Grutter case and Metro that diversity is a compelling governmental interest, and you could take race into effect as one of many factors, and that would be perfect for comparative hearings, but we don't have comparative hearings anymore. Okay, so this is one of the problems, is the FCC actually lacks the authority to reinstate some of the policies that they've used effectively in the past, preferences and comparative hearings. The other one would be tax certificates. And this is because Congress eliminated comparative hearings for commercial broadcast stations and required auctions in 1997, and they also repealed the tax certificates. And I agree with Commissioner McDowell that Congress ought to pass legislation on tax certificates. The third measure, the one that was distress sales, which was also upheld by the Metro Court, was modified in 2008 to make it a race-neutral policy. So now the Commission will allow distress sales to any eligible entity as defined under the Small Business Administration's definition of a small business. And under that definition, for example, a radio station is considered owner is considered a small business if its annual revenues are less than $13 million. Now, the FCC also currently has several other race and gender neutral policies designed to expand opportunities for minorities and women as part of small businesses and new entrants. And most of these policies do involve some sort of preference for so-called eligible entities. For example, the Commission allows the sale of grandfathered radio station combinations that exceed local ownership limits to eligible entities. It also allows the holders of construction permits to avoid forfeiting the permit when it's about to expire by selling it to an eligible entity. It has different attribution rules to promote financing for eligible entities. And that also has something called the failing station solicitation rule that requires the owner of a failing television station to demonstrate efforts to find an out-of-market buyer before requesting a waiver to sell it to another station in the market. This rule, which was adopted in 1999 and reaffirmed in 2008, because the FCC explained that it was necessary to ensure that out-of-market buyers, including qualified minority broadcasters, have notice of and an opportunity to bid for a station before it is combined with an in-market station. So to meet the requirement that race-based measures be narrowly tailored, the FCC has to show that it tried or at least considered race-neutral solutions and found them insufficient. And clearly the FCC can't do this if it doesn't analyze the effectiveness of its current policies. Yet, to my knowledge, it has never done so. There's two different inquiries that are entailed here. First, whether the policy has resulted in transfers to small businesses or new entrants, regardless of race and gender. For example, if no licenses are ever designated for hearing and there's no opportunity for distress sales, then that's not going to be an effective policy. If they have resulted in sales to eligible entities, then I think the Commission really needs to take the next step and say, well, how has that affected minorities and women in particular, given the vast underrepresentation? Statistically, it seems unlikely that these current policies will be effective because the FCC itself admits that 61% of radio stations are eligible entities, and of that number, only about 8.5% are minority controlled, and which is far below the percentage of minorities in any other relevant comparison you would want to make. And the Commission has not even made such an estimate as to small businesses controlled by women. I guess my final point is that evaluating these policies is difficult without relevant and reliable data. Now, the FCC obviously has a lot of this data. For example, they know when construction permits are transferred or Granford combinations are transferred, but that data is not compiled or made readily available to the public. The Commission did amend its ownership form in 1998 specifically to get race and gender data, and it was revealed in 2006 through the work of people like Professor Byerly and others that this data was completely unreliable. So the Commission itself in 2008 decided to change that process, and yet we still don't have that data, and the deadline for filing that data has been extended repeatedly and now is indefinitely suspended. So it's very troubling to me that it's taking so long just to get this very basic data that you need to analyze the effectiveness of the current programs. So in conclusion, I have to candidly admit that the recent Supreme Court decisions on racial preferences, such as the schools case and the firefighters case, while they're not on point, they do indicate that it is going to be difficult to convince a majority of the current justices that race-based preferences are constitutional. But I don't think that this means that the FCC shouldn't try. The FCC really needs to assess the effectiveness of existing policies and consider other race-neutral proposals, and there are quite a few out there. One of the most important would be to further tighten ownership rules so that there are more stations available and there's less concentration. I think minorities, there's lots of evidence that that's going to help minorities. There's also a proposal that Media Access Project has put forth for using this the multicast digital spectrum. But so it may be that these can be effective, and that would be wonderful. I would be thrilled. But if they're not, then we'll know that, and then the Commission can think about how they can actually adopt effective race-based policies, and then they'll have the record that would be necessary for a court victory. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Campbell. Our next panelist is Professor Alan Hammond. Professor Hammond holds the Phil and Bobby Sanfilippo Chair at Santa Clara University. He's been a professor at Santa Clara Law since 1998, and he serves as the director of the Broadband Institute of California. He's the former president of the Alliance for Public Technology, the director of the Law and Public Policy Program at the Center for Science Technology and Society at Santa Clara University. He's the author of many articles and the editor with Barbara Cherry and Stephen Wildman of Making Universal Service Policy, Enhancing the Process Through Multidisciplinary Evaluation. Professor Hammond earned his J.D. from the University of Pennsylvania School of Law and his M.A. from the Annenberg School of Communications at the University of Pennsylvania. Welcome, Professor Hammond.
Thank you. Thank you to the FCC for inviting me this morning and to the Media Bureau. I'm going to address my remarks to some of the questions that the Commission raised in correspondence with us prior to the workshop. So it'll be a little disjointed in that regard. The first question I'm going to address is whether or not there's evidence of that non-targeted measures have been insufficient with regard to minority ownership and female ownership. In Off the Dial, which is the female and minority radio station ownership in the United States, published by the Free Press, they noted that in 2007, racial and ethnic minorities accounted for 33% of the U.S. population. Minorities accounted for 7.7% of all full-power commercial radio stations, compared to whites' ownership of commercial radio stations at about 87%. Minority ownership of television stations was approximately 3.3%. So, by comparison, in other industries such as transportation and healthcare, minorities own businesses at levels near their proportion in the general population, but at over 4 times below their proportion of the general population. Broadcast station ownership by minorities and women is lower than every sector of the economy tracked by the Census Bureau except for mining and enterprise management. Thus, current non-targeted measures are insufficient. But we can go back to the FCC's own policy statement on minority ownership in 1978, where the FCC concluded that despite its race-neutral efforts to enhance diversity of viewpoint through employment opportunity, community ascertainment, the views of minority Americans remained inadequately represented in the broadcast media, and that inadequacy adversely affected the American public's right to diversity. So faced with the documented inadequacy of these minority portrayals and representation in broadcasting, and mindful of the statutory prohibition against censorship, and cognizant of the editorial control vested in broadcast licensees, the FCC implemented the minority ownership policies, which we've heard discussed earlier today. Now, does there currently exist sufficient empirical data under these factors? I think Angela Campbell has spoken very eloquently to that, as has Carolyn Byerly. I think the answer is no at the present time, and I refer you to their remarks. I'm going to go ahead and be a little more optimistic than Angela was with regard to the current constitutional state of the law. Another question was, what has been the effect of the decisions in Grutter and Gratz on the Adarand standard? So as I'm sure everyone in this audience knows, in Adarand, the Supreme Court held that the intermediate scrutiny standard for review employed by the court in Metro was inappropriate and overruled the Metro Broadcasting decision with regard to the standard. The majority there stated all racial classifications imposed by whatever federal, state, or local governmental actor must be analyzed by a reviewing court under strict scrutiny. In other words, such classifications are constitutional only if they are narrowly tailored measures that further compelling governmental interest. So to the extent that Metro Broadcasting is inconsistent with that holding, it is overruled. Now, a narrow reading of Adarand regarding the Metro precedent would support a conclusion that only the standard of review was at issue, but as we know, in Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals argued that as a result of the decision in Adarand, the Metro Broadcasting decision was overruled with regard to broadcast diversity being a compelling governmental interest. In this context, the decision in Grutter is of particular importance. Grutter's majority established that diversity is a compelling state interest for purposes of determining the constitutionality of race-based governmental action in the context of equal protection jurisprudence. Now, it's been asked whether or not we can argue that under Grutter, that diversity in broadcasting is a compelling state interest under the strict scrutiny standard, and whether or not the Commission could overcome the D.C. Circuit's decision in Lutheran Church that broadcast diversity does not rise to the level of a compelling interest. It also was asked whether or not the Supreme Court's suggestion in Parents Involved that the diversity interest found in Grutter does not extend beyond higher education. So I'm going to take a run at that now. In Bakke, the Supreme Court determined that the attainment of a diverse student body was constitutionally permissible as a goal for an institution of higher education. In Grutter, the court not only upheld Bakke's reasoning, but extended it, and in Justice O'Connor's analysis of the benefits of diversity in Grutter included promotion of cross-racial understanding, breakdown of racial stereotypes, a more enlightened and interesting level of discussion, greater learning outcomes, and more importantly, a better prepared and more diverse professional workforce, military, and society. Thus, the court held that even under strict scrutiny analysis, student body diversity is a compelling state interest that can justify the use of race in university admissions. Now, O'Connor's opinion in Grutter seemed to stretch the application and the benefits of diversity far beyond the boundaries of higher learning. The benefits of diversity that O'Connor listed are not isolated to the context of a law school, but are in fact significant social benefits of diversity per se. Gratz, decided on the same day as Grutter, provides an important point of clarification. In Gratz, the petitioners argued that diversity as a basis for employing racial preferences is simply too open-ended, ill-defined, and indefinite. The Supreme Court rejected that argument, citing its rationale in Grutter without limitation to higher education applications. After Grutter, several lower courts interpreted the structure of Grutter and Gratz to suggest a broader reading of diversity as a compelling state interest. In Lomax, in a case about racial diversity in firehouses, the Third Circuit overturned the New Jersey District Court's interpretation of Grutter, stating that Grutter does not stand for the proposition that the benefits of diversity are always a compelling state interest, regardless of the context. However, the court Rather, the court in Grutter held that, that holding stands for the proposition that educational benefits of diversity can be compelling to an institution whose mission is to educate. Now, that can be interpreted as much broader than just education, schools. There, the court found that the fire department's mission is not to educate. However, in Pettit, the Seventh Circuit used the rationale in Grutter in its analysis of the Chicago Police Department and found that there is an even more compelling need for diversity in such a context, thus applying Grutter's compelling state interest in the social benefits of a diverse police force. Pettit has not been overruled, and it continues to be good law, even with Ritchie. Now, parents involves potential to limit Grutter. I suggest that Justice Kennedy's concurrence is instructive in that regard. Diversity remains a compelling state interest, and race may be used as a factor in attaining the social benefits of that diversity as long as all other race-neutral options have been exhausted, or race is used as only one factor in a holistic approach to examining an individual. While it can be argued that the majority holding in Grutter is context-specific to higher education, Justice Kennedy's concurrence disagrees with the majority on this point, shifting the weight of the court to the dissenting side. And while one plurality attempted to dismiss the benefits of racial balancing altogether, it could not attain the majority support and is only dicta. In fact, although Kennedy did not join the dissent, his concurrence gives the dissent a majority in the premise that race-based considerations are appropriate in pursuing the social benefits of diversity. Kennedy's concurrence held that diversity, depending on its meaning and definition, is a compelling educational goal a school district may pursue. Now, the dissent and parents involved sought to expand Grutter, allowing the broad use of race-conscious criteria, including to cure racial isolation, but Kennedy declined to join that, believing that this was too broad. Therefore, the standard that Kennedy believes is appropriate is somewhere in the middle, between a complete elimination of racial balance and a permissive, if you will, racial balancing standard. It is a narrow standard under which race is merely one factor among many that describe individuals, and as such, it may be weighed and considered in context where diversity is beneficial. I know I have not much time left, and I want to move on to some other points. The Commission also asked if the Commission could show that broadcast diversity is a compelling state interest, how could it establish a sufficient nexus between ownership diversity and diversity in viewpoint programming? There have been a number of studies on the nexus between minority ownership and broadcast diversity. Some of them authorized or it's initiated by the FCC. There was one by Sandoval most recently, which was not authorized by the FCC, but it was a very good study with some support, minor support from Hammond and Honig, that evidence of the nexus between minority commercial radio ownership, diversity, and service in the public interest. Minority radio broadcasters overwhelmingly contribute to the diversity of American radio programming by airing minority-oriented formats. 72.5%, or 591 of the 852 minority-owned commercial radio stations air minority-oriented formats. And that number is even higher if the silent minority-owned stations are eliminated. In Bakken, Hammond, and Mason and Kraft in 1999, which was a study initiated by the FCC, this study addressed O'Connor's dissent in Metro about how to measure viewpoints and about the nexus between race and or ethnicity of the station owner and content. Given the First Amendment values behind the diversity rationale, the research focused on speech that courts have held to be at the core of the First Amendment's protections, news and public affairs programming. In this regard, the study also examined whether race or ethnicity of the station owner affected the quantity of news in the public affairs programming and whether it impacts the likelihood of the stations to cover particular issues of interest. The findings revealed that minority-owned stations, especially radio stations, differed in several ways from their majority-owned counterparts in decisions made about programming and news focus. Minority-owned radio stations were significantly more likely to choose a program format that appealed to a minority or ethnic audience and to provide news and public affairs programming of particular concern to minority or ethnic audiences. They were also more likely to tailor their news stories to minority community concerns. I'm assuming am I out of time? Yeah, I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Professor Hammond. Our final panelist for this first panel is Professor LaVonda Reed Huff. Professor Reed Huff is an associate professor of law at the Syracuse University College of Law. She teaches communication law, property, and wills and trusts. Professor Reed Huff has published numerous scholarly works and law review articles addressing broadcast ownership, political broadcast advertisements, and placement of satellite dishes and clean energy devices, which I guess not necessarily part of the topic presentation today. In 2001, she was named a fellow with the Institute for the Study of the Judiciary, Politics and Media at Syracuse University. She earned her Bachelor of Arts degree in economics from the University of Virginia and a law degree from the University of Southern California. Welcome, Professor Reed Huff.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today. I want to thank the Media Bureau and the Commission for addressing the issue of media consolidation and ownership by women and minorities. It's an honor to speak with you today regarding these topics of great importance to our American democracy. As I wrote in a law review article several years ago, it is imperative that while the Commission goes about addressing the issue of localism in broadcasting, it must not lose sight of the continued relevance and importance of minority ownership. While localism and minority ownership are closely tied, they must be addressed as distinct issues. Additionally, it is important that the Commission not forget about broadcasting as it goes about the important work of addressing broadband availability and accessibility in rural and low-income areas. Unfortunately, as we have heard today, the current landscape of media ownership is not particularly encouraging. The number of minority broadcast licensees, as we have heard, has dropped significantly since the enactment of the Telecommunications Act of 1996, and broadcasters of all races are facing increasing competition from the internet and other media platforms. Advertising dollars and bank financing are harder to secure as a result of economic challenges facing our country's businesses and as a result of broadcast markets laden with assets bought at inflated prices in recent years. Additionally, minority licensees as well as non-minority licensees broadcasting radio formats appealing to minority audiences continue to face discriminatory practices by advertisers. This sad reality is worsened by an overabundance of syndicated programming on urban radio stations and the unfavorable allocation of advertising dollars derived from syndicated programming. The answer to the question of how the Commission might improve minority and women ownership statistics is not an easy one, and I commend the Commission for undertaking it. As a communications law scholar and a member of the Syracuse community, I have witnessed the impact of the lack of any minority-owned broadcast outlets in the city's communities of color. In the 1990s, local businessmen Robert Short and Butch Charles were licensed to operate full-power radio stations in Syracuse. They were the first and only African Americans ever to hold an FM radio license in the city. During their time as licensees, both men fulfilled lifelong dreams of becoming broadcasters and delivering relevant, useful, and high-quality informational and entertaining programming to their community. By most accounts, they were successful in that endeavor. However, the consolidation resulting from the 1996 Act made it nearly impossible for them and other small licensees, regardless of race, to compete with conglomerates for advertising dollars which are necessary to manage overhead and other financial costs. As a result, both men were saddled with significant debt burdens and opted to sell their stations to non-minorities who had less of a connection to their audiences and who saw the urban format primarily in terms of dollars and cents and less as a platform for civic engagement and education. The result is that Syracuse now has only one radio station primarily serving its African American community. The station is owned by non-minorities, and although having made significant positive changes in the past year, struggles to maintain simultaneously profitable and relevant, simultaneously profitable and relevant to its target audience. The new public affairs program offered by this particular station was just launched last week and seems to be successful. It's a 2-hour-long program hosted by a local leader. It's a call-in program where members of the community are able to discuss topics of relevance on the national level as well as on the local level. In the past year, Syracuse also lost an African American television station due to a shared services agreement that transferred management of that station to a non-minority owned corporation that also owns and operates another major network affiliate in the market. The two television stations now simulcast the same news programming, depriving the market of an essential voice and independent source of information. In my work with local media outlets, I hear a continuing concern among those serving communities of color about the difficulty they face in securing advertising dollars from local and national businesses. In 2010, there is still a reluctance of advertisers to purchase time on urban radio. Although the Commission requires broadcasters to certify upon license renewal that they include in their advertising sales contracts non-discrimination clauses prohibiting so-called no urban and no Spanish dictates, this practice continues, making it more difficult for stations serving those communities to survive in an advertising-driven radio market. Advertisers continue to forego purchasing airtime on urban radio stations so as not to encourage minority patronage of their businesses, products, and services, and because of a sentiment that the minority listening audience cannot be persuaded via the medium to patronize their businesses in some cases. The Commission must actively enforce the rules prohibiting discriminatory practices in advertising. Additionally, to the extent that licensees and advertisers are suspected of violating other federal and state anti-discrimination laws, the Commission must not turn a blind eye. In recent years, as we have heard, the federal judiciary has not been particularly friendly to affirmative action programs intended to help racial minorities. The Supreme Court, as we have heard, has held that the appropriate constitutional standard to evaluate race-based governmental programs is that of strict scrutiny. Under this standard, the government's program must serve a compelling governmental interest, and the program must be narrowly tailored to serving that interest. In 1990, the Supreme Court in Metro Broadcasting applied a lower standard in the context of broadcasting, but in Adarand versus Pena, and most recently in Parents Involved in Community Schools versus Seattle School District, cases not involving broadcast licensees, the court has adhered to the more formidable strict scrutiny standard. In Metro Broadcasting, the court upheld 2 FCC programs designed to increase minority broadcasting ownership. It held that neither the Commission's minority enhancement credit policy nor its distress sale policy violated the equal protection component of the Fifth Amendment because the benign race-conscious measures mandated by Congress, even if they were not remedial, served an important governmental objective and were sufficiently tailored to that end. The court held in Adarand, however, that the court in Metro Broadcasting had applied the wrong standard. It remains unclear after these cases whether the court will deem broadcast diversity to be a compelling governmental interest. Equally unclear is whether the court will require additionally that the Commission demonstrate use of the least restrictive alternative in furthering an interest in broadcast diversity, as could be inferred from a requirement from reading cases challenging FCC policies and rules in other contexts. Although the court has recognized diversity in education as a compelling governmental interest, it has differed, in Grutter versus Bollinger and Parents Involved as to whether the particular program in question actually did serve a compelling governmental interest and whether the program was narrowly tailored to serving that interest. It remains unclear to what extent analogies can be drawn between diversity in education and diversity in broadcasting. I would argue that diversity in broadcasting is no less and perhaps even more compelling than diversity in education as it relates to our American democracy. In 1998, in Lutheran Church, Missouri Synod versus FCC, the D.C. Circuit, in reviewing the Commission's equal employment opportunity rules, indeed questioned whether broadcast diversity could ever be a compelling governmental interest. I believe it is. The government has a compelling interest in broadcast program diversity as well as broadcast ownership diversity. The broadcast media is essential to our democracy, serving as a check on the 3 branches of government and continuing to serve a compelling government educational and informative function for the millions of households that still rely solely on free over-the-air signals for television, the millions who listen to broadcast radio for news and information, as well as the millions who receive broadcast programming via subscriptions, cable or satellite service. Despite a highly competitive current media landscape populated by cable and satellite service, the internet, and highly capable mobile devices of all sorts, the broadcast media continues to be relevant and a vital part of our democracy, serving to educate and inform children and adults as well on issues of paramount local and national importance, including politics, education, healthcare, the arts, and social justice, as well as a variety of global issues. The fact has been brought to bear, or was brought to bear so profoundly last election cycle in 2008 in the presidential campaign. Today, people of color continue to rely significantly on free over-the-air broadcast signals to keep them connected and engaged in the world around them, as was shown by Professor Baines in his slides. Barriers to entry, such as monthly access fees for broadband service and early termination fees for mobile service, suggest that the internet and mobile devices are not adequate substitutes for free over-the-air broadcast service. As such, significant efforts must be expended to ensure that they continue. Diversity of programming choices is essential to achieving a balanced view of current issues and events, and a diverse ownership is essential to achieving diverse programming. As it relates to localism, local communities are best served by locally owned, managed, and operated licensees. As it relates to people of color, it is logical to assume that their interests are best served by outlets that are managed and owned by licensees who are people of color with local ties to those communities. Any race-based program adopted by the Commission must be narrowly tailored to achieving the compelling governmental interest. In order to satisfy strict scrutiny, the Commission must have data on the programming choices of its licensees in order first to address the concerns about a nexus between minority ownership and programming, and second, to address the issue of narrowly tailoredness. The Commission should evaluate and compare the programming choices of small licensees operating 1 or 2 stations and compare those with their larger competitors. It must also gather accurate and analyze the data about ownership on Form 323. One thing that is apparent from our discussion today is that the Commission must have accurate and current data, and more importantly, it must thoroughly analyze this data. Finally, the Commission must investigate and evaluate its own past practices with an eye to any discriminatory practices it might have engaged in over the course of history. In sum, any program or policy designed to enhance minority ownership must clear significant constitutional hurdles. We take comfort, albeit little comfort, in the acknowledgement by the court in Adarand that strict scrutiny is not necessarily strict in theory but fatal in fact. With current analysis and current data, I think that we can survive strict scrutiny. Thank you, and I'm happy to assist the Commission in any way that I can.
Thank you, Professor Reed-Huff, and thank you to all the panelists. I guess this is a time period where we have for questions, and I figured I'd take the opportunity as moderator to start with the first question to all the panelists. I take it there's consensus, and I think I heard consensus, that the current state of the law is that race-conscious measures, at least by the Commission, would be subject to strict scrutiny. And strict scrutiny under the established standard means that we have to show a compelling interest and that the measure we take has to be narrowly tailored to advance that interest. I have a question that's slightly off to one side of that, but on the narrow tailoring part, which relates to the Commission's own institutional competence. There's a theme in the case law that whenever you take such measures for narrow tailoring, there has to be some kind of individualized consideration given. People can't be reduced to categories or to stereotypes. That the Commission had, I think, some ability to give that kind of individualized consideration back in the day of comparative hearing. Now, when most licenses or spectrum is auctioned and comparative hearings are a thing of the past, what are your thoughts about how the Commission can comply with the obligation, even assuming we can show a compelling interest, comply with the obligation to give individualized consideration? And I leave it up to you if whoever's got the first idea can talk first. Or I'll call upon Professor Baines since he's first. Since he had the most time to think about everything.
Yes, and the perils of starting your name beginning with the first part of the alphabet. I think that in terms of individualized consideration, that what the commission probably needs to do is make sure they view each potential applicant individually. And under the comparative hearing process, that was easier. Of course, we don't have comparative hearing processes now, but there's no reason why the commission couldn't have some sort of hybrid process where they did some sort of internal review of candidates before they put them out for auction, so that, all the candidates that you're looking at have to meet some sort of test. And remember, it can't be just race. It has to be a variety of different factors that you're looking at. And in making those determinations, whether it's veteran status, new business entrants, low income, racial minority women, et cetera, that you then sort of make sure everyone sort of fits into that category and meets whatever your various standards are for review, and then put them out for auction if that's what you're planning to do, or under the tax deviate policy, those are the ones who would qualify. And I think that would be a way to...
Does that mean the commission, or maybe the Media Bureau, has to establish a sub-office that replicates to some extent the law school admissions office that was at issue in Grutter?
Probably, yes. It would probably be some sort of review like that. That would be my suggestion, which would be to see if you can sort of parallel it as closely as possible to tagging on the FCC's current regime in terms of distributing licenses with sort of a process sort of very similar to what law schools do in terms of admissions.
Do any of the other panelists have a reaction or to that idea?
I guess I would support Lynn's observation. It seems to me that in the auction process, the commission still establishes at least a minimal set of criteria by which it determines that someone is eligible to even participate in the auction, or in a lottery if you were to do a lottery. Or so the real issue is the criteria that you establish. It seems to me that historically, broadcasting has had an educational function. Whether you talk about news and public affairs or children's broadcasting or political broadcasting, those are phenomenally important. There's quite a bit of ink that the FCC has expended on that. I would think that would be one of the criteria that you would have, and then the question would then be, to the extent that you are using minority ownership or female ownership as one of a number of different criteria, that there'd be some evidence that ownership will result in the kinds of educational benefits that the commission is trying to achieve.
I agree with Al. I think the thing that we have to make they're concerned about is that it's not just any minority or any woman, right, that we have to look to make sure that they meet whatever standards and that they're actually going to provide the kind of diversity that you're looking for. And so as a result, that's the reason why you'd probably have to have some intermediate step before you actually put them out to auction.
Well, that raises an interesting question, the diversity that we're looking for, because while the commission has for many years thought that minority ownership policies would promote diversity, it's not been as effective in defining what the diversity it's talking about, what diversity it's talking about. In particular, I'd like the panelists to address about whether we're talking about diversity in programming alone or other kinds of diversity, and whether the diversity we're looking for is a means to an end or an end in itself.
Well, I've always understood diversity to really be focused on, in significant measure, what the broadcaster is supposed to be providing, which is service to the public. And we live in a very diverse society, so the idea would be in part that broadcaster is going to do what we used to do, speaking as a former broadcaster. I was at JLA here in Washington, D.C. for a number of years and had to oversee the ascertainment process, so I know both the pluses and the minuses. But one of the things we were required to do was actually meet with the public and find out what the public wanted and what the public was concerned about and what the public needed. I think that there was a mistake to remove that as a criteria, to assume that the marketplace would take care of that. So in addressing the issue of diversity, if you live in a diverse society, in a diverse community, it would seem perfectly normal and logical that you would be determining what that community's concerns were. And I guess I'd answer the question that way.
Dr. Bartley?
I guess I want to go back to some of the points that I made about the true need for the Commission to go back to some kind of stated criteria for public interest. They have been missing for a couple of decades, and I think all broadcasters, regardless of who they are, or all owners, would be able to better figure out whether they're serving the public's interest if there were a stated set of criteria. But I think it's a correct assumption on the part of the courts and the Commission and others to assume that there is a relationship between people coming from a particular community and being able to better serve that community. So I would agree with Professor Baines that any woman or any minority wouldn't necessarily be able to meet the needs of the community they biologically represent. We hope that they also have bring some other evidence that they represent the needs and interests and concerns of that community at the time that they apply for their stations, and be able to show that.
How do you think, what kind of showing do you think that you contemplate they would make? Is it a programming commitment, or is it a look
Yes.
backwards at their history?
I think the educational programming, the public interest, the public affairs programming, what do they intend to do? I mean, what sorts of things do they see need to be covered? And again, if, one of the other studies that I suggested is that we need to go out and really ask people in communities what they need. When we asked people in the Washington, D.C. communities, we were rather interested to see that they wanted to know how to get involved in their communities. They knew, for instance, in one community that had a high crime rate, they said, we know that there are groups out there working on this, but we don't have any idea who they are, how to get in touch with them. I mean, so the day of PSAs has sort of gone away, and all they get is music and, other entertainment, maybe talk shows, but they don't necessarily provide that kind of information. So I think we have to get some of our indicators and criteria about what is the public interest and what do they need from the public themselves. That means getting out and asking people.
Professor Reedhuff?
I would agree with what Professor Byerly just said about asking the people what they need, what they want, what the communities want. I think it's very easy for us to sit here as academics and government officials kind of in our ivory tower without actually getting out to the people to figure out what it is they need. But on the other point as well, analogizing this to law schools, from a law school, if we were to look at local media markets as a potential law school class or law school population, in admissions in law schools, we don't particularly look for everyone to be the same. We're not necessarily looking for homogenous. We certainly would not like a homogenous student body, but in diversity, we're looking for people to bring a variety of different perspectives to the table. So not everyone from the same high school, not everyone from the same undergraduate institution. So to the extent that we could look at media markets as a potential law school class, to draw the analogy, we're looking for people coming from a variety of different places with a lot of different perspectives to enhance the voices in the marketplace and hopefully enhance our democracy. So I would say that programming commitments such as public interest and educational commitments might not be unwarranted. I mean, we do put certain educational obligations on television broadcasters. I don't see why it could not be imposed similarly on radio broadcasters.
Anybody? Professor Campbell?
You sort of posed the question as, what do we mean by diversity? Is it program content or is it process? And I think it's both. And I think part of the problem here is that the FCC has used that word in so many ways over the years that it is hard to put your finger on it. Maybe we need a different word. But I think that this is the sort of the problem, is that if you have a greater diversity in terms of decision makers about what goes on the air, then you are going to end up with different diversity of programming. But it's hard to analyze because you'd be doing content studies. I mean, people do them, and they do show that there is diversity, but it is very hard to really build a whole lot of data. But I think that it's not one or the other, it's really both.
Anybody else? Any further thoughts?
Well, I think that the individualized consideration analysis in terms of the narrow tailoring sort of focuses mostly on sort of diversity rationale as opposed to the discrimination rationale. So under discrimination rationale, I don't know if you would necessarily need to do, specifically it's remedial, so you're trying to fix the problem. The problem with the diversity is that it's so amorphous. What does that mean? And that's why the courts say you have to have this individualized determination. But for a discrimination rationale, it's a remedy, and so it's sort of more of a blunter. It's a somewhat blunter instrument. You still have to have the narrow tailoring that it has to be, a short time period, and as you look at sort of the problems that it might affect on sort of non-minorities and that you've considered race-neutral measures. But I don't know if you would necessarily have to do individualized determination for the discrimination rationale.
Well, that's a very good point. Professor Baines, you had mentioned, I think in your presentation, the Commission's, passive complicity or in past discrimination. I'd like to get the other panelists' reaction about, and yours as well, about whether we have sufficient evidence or whether we can gather sufficient evidence to have that strong evidence of the record that the courts seem to require for the past discrimination rationale. I take it that even with the cutback by the courts, that there is still settled that you can employ race-conscious measures to remedy past discrimination. The problem comes in proving that past discrimination. So I guess it's, again, a two-part question. One is, do you think that if we could show the FCC's passive complicity, that would be enough for a strong basis in evidence, or what kind of further evidence would we need to show to employ remedying past discrimination as our rationale for measures?
Well, I guess one of the things that comes to mind almost immediately is the WLBT situation, in which the Commission had evidence that the community was not being, the total community was not being served, that in fact portions of the community were being purposefully excluded, and that there was concern about that, and the Commission took quite a while, and took really the forcing by the D.C. Circuit for the Commission to finally acknowledge the discrimination that was going on and to actually do something about it. That its prior policy with regard to station renewals had been to just renew the station and say, well, do something about it, but not really actually follow through to make sure that something actually had been done. One question would be, to the extent that the Commission engaged in those types of hearings on renewal in the past, I mean, how many of those situations were there? How many times did that happen? How many complaints did the Commission receive that were not acted on? Now, that's going to be difficult because I don't know what kind of data the Commission actually has on that from those time periods. But that would be one thing to look at. There certainly have been decisions by the Commission to facilitate, let's say, ownership policies in terms of multiple ownership, either within markets or nationally, that have had or could have had adverse impacts on minorities. And so in that sense, the Commission, by virtue of not considering, in many instances, the impact of its policies on minority efforts to acquire stations or on female efforts to acquire stations, could be said to be complicit in that sense.
The way the courts look at this is at least in the construction area, is that it is the passive complicity is the government is infusing tax dollars into industries that are discriminating against the people who are getting these licenses or these rights to use, to get these contracts. And so take Adarand for itself. Adarand, the court came up with this test of strict scrutiny, but on remand, the discrimination, the first prong was easily met. I mean, and the Justice Department actually did this full review after Adarand to sort of highlight sort of all the discrimination that had taken place, especially in capital markets. I mean, I think that's very well known that most minority and women-owned businesses sort of face that. And really the discussion was all on the second test, part of the test of whether it was narrowly tailored on remand. And so I think one of the things is that, the FCC probably needs to review the studies that were done in the late 90s to see whether they are still relevant. I think some of them are. And whether there's any additional ones that need to be done. For instance, there weren't any really done with respect to women owners with respect to sort of the discrimination, some of the discrimination they faced. And then sort of figure out, well, that's enough of a record, and bolster it with other evidence in other industries that show there's probably that discrimination still that a lot of businesses actually face. especially the capital market discrimination. And then then the next step is, crafting rules that are narrowly tailored that address that aspect of the discrimination, the discrimination that you've seen or that you've identified.
Professor Campbell?
This is a tough question for a couple of reasons. One is that the most of the cases that we've looked at involve where there's actually been a trial, there's been evidence presented to a court, and it wasn't the court that was the one that was accused of discrimination. And in contracting, for example, there is a history of discrimination in contracting, but it's also the case that the government's constantly giving new contracts, and there's an opportunity to compete for those new contracts. The peculiar problem in broadcasting is that the initial licenses given out way, in the 30s and so forth, for free, and there weren't women and minorities that got those licenses. And then basically the people that had AM licenses, well, first of all, they never lost their licenses, and then they were able to parlay them and to get an FM station and then to get a TV station. And so the consequences of the very early discrimination are carried forward all the time, and there's very few opportunities because of the licensing process itself, the fact you have to have a license for minorities and women to break into that process. And they make them, they've been economically successful, and they can use that money to continue to be successful. So so it's hard to really compare. And then you have the other problem is that I think the Commission actually made a great start in these studies that were released in 2000, but someone really has to do the really hard analysis of, is this enough? And if not, what else do we need to look at? I mean, I know of some, anecdotes and some other examples. Like, for example, the Commission itself found when they reduced the requirements for broadcast, the financial requirements, what they found that financial requirements that they had a discriminatory impact. So I think there is more that could be developed, but someone really just has to do that hard work, and I think it has to be the Commission, because the Commission's the one that's going to be defending it in court. But it's an awkward position for the Commission, because the Commission is the one that has to admit that either they actively or passively discriminated. So it's just a tough thing, but again, I think the Commission needs to do that hard analysis.
Yeah, I guess I'd have one follow-up question on the active-passive distinction, because I know that there's a theme in the courts now that you have to show that we're remedying discrimination by the governmental entity. And if all that we could show is that the Commission passed through discrimination by others, is that enough? And would we have to show, even in a passive sense, that we were on notice that there was actual discrimination going on? I think Professor Hammond's example of failure to act in the face of hard evidence of discrimination is a good one. But that's only one example, and the global issues of discrimination in financing, or capital markets discrimination, or advertising discrimination. It's unclear to me yet how much the Commission was put on notice that there was active discrimination going on there, other than just they get an applicant, they mechanically evaluate the applicant's qualifications, and they approve the license or not. Any thoughts?
Well, I think there are other examples. I mean, the Commission, many of the entities that receive licenses were segregated schools and segregated state governments and that sort of thing. But I guess the question really, the harder question for me is how much of that do you really need to show? And also, I think showing intent. When you're looking at, an agency that's evolved and changed over so many years and so many different people, it's just hard to even figure out, even if you found, evidence that a commissioner was racist, so what? I mean, that's what's hard about it. But I'll stop there. Other people may know more about it.
I don't know if you have to, for this purposes, I don't think you have to have conclusive evidence of, a formal finding by a court of discrimination or intent. I mean, I don't read the cases as showing that you need intent. I mean, you need to have a substantial basis of evidence that there was some sort of discrimination. And in terms of, whether you have to have notice, I mean, I think that's a sort of an open question. But clearly there have been a lot of other hearings that the FCC has had where broadcasters, minority broadcasters, women broadcasters have testified and notified the commission that there were capital market discrimination or the advertising discrimination. I mean, I think this is, this has been, the commission has been on notice of some of these things for a number of years, and, just really took some action now with the advertising discrimination, and, hasn't really taken action with some of the other things. So I think, you probably could find evidence of notice if you look for it.
I think there, just to add, probably being one of the oldest people here, if you go back even to the Van Deerlen hearings back in the 70s, you'll find extensive hearings on advertising and the impact of advertising decisions on minority efforts to have viable stations. So I second everything that Len and Carolyn have said, Angela rather, have said with regard to this issue, but I think that there is evidence that the commission could go back and fill in with. And they did have notice.
To the extent that notice might be required at all, I mean, there are different types of notice as well. There's actual notice where you actually know that there's been discrimination based on evaluation of the commission's past practices. But to follow up on what Professor Baines was saying, the commission very well could be found to have been on inquiry notice, the duty, imposing the duty to ask further questions. And because there have been so many hearings over the years and there have been so many allegations of discrimination in a variety of areas relating to broadcasting, I think there could logically be reached a conclusion that there was at least inquiry notice, which might in fact satisfy any notice requirement if there is any.
Dr. Bartley?
I'm concerned that no one's talking about conglomeration. Maybe I'm a lone voice here. I think we've got, and I don't know where this fits into the passive-active, except I think it's probably a passive issue. In allowing conglomeration to continue and allowing the richer, I think the Syracuse case that LaVonda brought up is really excellent. I lived in that market area, and I know the stations you're talking about, and I felt the loss because I've moved since that happened, and I was sorry to hear that. I think that, and it's happened with women's stations particularly. I mean, one of the things we did when we got such low response rate to our survey among women owners is we called about 180 stations to see what the status was of ownership. And we found that from the time that the ownership reports had been posted and the time that we called, many of them had sold out. And they had sold out to Clear Channel and a lot of the other big places. And I think as long as this process is allowed to continue, that you're going to have fewer and fewer people owning the stations, and they're not serving diverse communities. And I think whether you call it active or passive involvement, I think that this is, the conglomeration issue is something that seems to be a taboo. We can't talk about it. And I've actually heard people from the inside of the government and the policy-making process say it's not likely to happen. Nobody's likely to touch it. And I want to know why. I want to know why. And I want to know why we can't have studies that really show the impact of it and its detrimental impact across communities. The demographics of this country are changing very rapidly, and this process is not serving the public interest. So I would just put the conglomeration issue on the table and see what we can do about it.
Do the other panelists agree that the commission's, at least in the past decade or so, rules that have allowed further consolidation have had an adverse impact on minority ownership? I think
it has. We're updating a study now that we did on for the commission on the impact of the failed station solicitation rule and its impact on actually not the failed station solicitation rule so much as the local market agreements, the tacit allowing of the local market agreements to continue, and what that did to potentially to minority-owned stations and female-owned stations in a number of markets. I know Angela and I, the first time I met Angela was when we were working on the commission's decision to expand the number of radio stations an entity could own back in the 80s. And we were saying back then, and the National Association of Black-Owned Broadcasters and others were saying back then, you're going to make it more difficult for us to actually compete. They've been saying that for years. The commission knows that. The commission has not done and this is the Commission broadly stated, obviously, it changes over time. The Commission has not done the work to determine what the impact of those types of policies are. In fact, the Prometheus case was about the fact that the FCC had not done that work. So it seems to me clear that the FCC is on notice that there's at least an issue that it ought to be paying attention to, and that there is a need for more data and more analysis and investigation as to how its policies in one area affect its policies in another area. And it doesn't make those connections sometimes.
Now, you mentioned LMAs. Could you just expand upon that for a second about why the dynamic you think that's at play there?
Well, basically, what the LMAs allowed some entities in the markets to do is expand the number of stations that they could actually control in the market. They did it by contract as opposed to by ownership. But by virtue of those agreements, they were able to have greater impact on advertising in terms of who was approached to place ads with, and it had an impact on programming because it changed your costs of operation. And if you look at the entities that benefited from that, they were mostly the large multiple owners of stations, and they were able in markets to have several stations in that market control advertisers, in the sense that advertisers knew if you didn't go to them first, you would lose a substantial portion of the market to have access to. They also were able to control programming costs. I actually documented some of that in the study. So economies of scale is basically what we're dealing with there. And so your single station owners, if you look at who benefited from the duopoly rules when you basically removed the LMA restriction, it was not minority-owned stations and female-owned stations, or small stations for that matter. It was the large group owners who benefited because they were in a position to benefit. They were the ones who had the LMAs, and they were the ones who knew basically and had the right of first refusal in some instances on acquiring those stations.
Professor Reed Huff, you had a...
Excuse me. The shared services agreement that I referenced in my comments has resulted in two large network media affiliates coming under common ownership of one owner. And one of the owners, one licensee actually is an African American licensee, the other a non-minority, but now under this agreement, the control is under the non-minority licensee. And as a result, we have the exact same news coverage in the morning, the exact same news coverage on two stations at noon, the exact same news coverage for the evening local news. And it's a huge loss in the television market as far as the diversity of voices and approach to and coverage of local events. So I would say that about television, but then also about radio and conglomeration. In our market, as I mentioned also, there used to be two African-American broadcasters in the city. Both of them are now, have sold their assets, and now there's only one station that's non-minority owned, focusing on an African-American audience. This is a conglomerate. They do have economies of scale, and how the advertising component is closely tied to what's going on here in Syracuse is that we are told that the African-American station is marginally profitable, and that they're not really able to get local businesses to buy time on the station. This conglomerate is able, they claim, to be able to somewhat subsidize the minority station through taking money, I guess, on the books from other stations in their holdings. But the unfortunate situation there is that they're not as closely tied, you might say, to the minority community. They're not local people necessarily, and they have corporate interests and different objectives than would be a local minority who is actually from Syracuse and addressing issues there. So the issues are very intricately tied together.
Professor Campbell, you had...
I agree absolutely with both Al and LaVonda. When I was preparing for this, I went back into my files, and there were some early comments from NABOB. I think it was in '95 when the commission first began looking at relaxing the local TV rules, and they were making the argument that this would have a terrible impact on opportunities for minorities. You know, I'm sure you go back much further than that and find the same thing being presented to the Commission. I know I have presented that argument in comments that we filed for the United Church of Christ and now and other groups in the 2002 biennial and the 2006 quadrennial. I mean, the court clearly understood that if to the extent you allow more consolidation, you make it harder for new entrants, that you need more capital in order to enter. And of course, we know that all the studies show that that's a problem for minorities and women. And if they can only if they get it at all, and they're one station competing against, commonly owned stations by a large outside corporation, they're just not really able to compete effectively. And I think there's some new study on this by Professor Sandoval that looked at how there have been a number of losses in terms of minority ownership in radio, a very detailed study. So I think, there's a clear impact. Everyone knows it. The court has specifically told the FCC that you have to look at them together. You can't separate them. You can't say, well, we're going to allow more consolidation, and then someday later on when we get all this evidence, we're going to adopt a policy to promote minority women ownership, because you've lost that opportunity and you've made it harder to ever get it back. So I think, that's why I'm saying the most important race-neutral thing you can do is to actually tighten the rules. We don't need a duopoly rule when every station in the country, television stations, can now multicast. They don't need to buy another station if they want to put more programming on. Or if they're not going to use their multicast channels, then those channels that spectrum should be made available to others. But I don't think you can really separate them, and I think that would be the thing that would really make the most important would be to make the rules tighter. But certainly don't relax the rules, because that'll just exacerbate a worse situation. And I think that makes the Commission quite implicit in that discrimination.
Well, it's a good segue to taking a couple of questions from the audience. The first one, and this is the questioner's characterization. Could it be argued that the relatively lax FCC practices on broadcast renewals helps to perpetuate effects of past discrimination? A regime in which more renewals were rejected could free up channels in urban areas where minority broadcasters could succeed. Does anybody have any reaction to that proposal? Professor?
Well, my sense is that Congress has spoken on that, and the changes in the way in which renewals are conducted is partly a function of the statute. But I think Angela's a little closer to that.
I think that could make a difference. But part of the problem is, in Congress, all Congress said is that they got rid of comparative renewals, but you could still lose your license if you're not serving the public interest. But it's very hard for, even if stations aren't serving the public interest, for anyone to make that kind of showing, because the data doesn't exist and the standards don't exist. And when people do file petitions to deny, the Commission just ignores them. There's a lot of pending petitions where companies have gotten waivers that were temporary, like a 2-year waiver, and they've managed to keep the station for 8-10 years. The Commission has done nothing about it. If the Commission would simply enforce its existing laws, there would be more stations available and less consolidation.
Dr. Barley?
I'd just like to, put a word or two in here. One of the things that we're beginning to look at Howard is public involvement in the whole monitoring of stations and the relicense, and where that fits into the relicensing process. And we're beginning to ask questions about whether moving from a 3-year renewal cycle to an 8-year has more or less shut out any kind of public scrutiny. There used to be a lot of that back in the old days when there was a 3-year cycle. I think we could well state a working hypothesis that that's pretty much gone away. When it's very difficult for public interest groups on the outside, for advocacy groups, to keep track of things, to mobilize scrutiny and monitoring over an 8-year period. And it's much easier if the period is shorter. And I think what we need to do is we need data to really show whether the public can legitimately and fruitfully be involved in monitoring their own public interests, so that they can make that essential input into the relicensing process.
Anyone else on that
I have nothing to add.
Let me ask, go back a little bit to the legal framework and ask, we've been talking about the framework applicable to race-conscious measures. Do the panelists think that there are additional race-neutral measures that the Commission might employ that would be effective to address this disparity of ownership? Or are we basically in agreement that to do anything in this area, you really are going to need to focus on race-conscious measures?
I go back to what Angela was saying. The Commission could enforce its rules, which would, in many cases, well, in some cases, certainly result in more stations being available. And the Commission could and should spend more time considering the impact of its rules on small and minority-owned and female-owned broadcast stations. I think that just knowing the impact, it may change the way in which the Commission fashions its rules.
I think one thing that the Commission may also consider doing, and that would be sort of could be considered race neutral, would be, what format are you really looking for? What is the diversity you're trying to get at? And can a broadcaster actually achieve that diversity? And the study that Al had done a few years ago, where he looked at, and it goes back to the diversity issue, he found that minority broadcasters were more likely to sort of honor sort of holidays, have more minority employees, to have more public service, sort of programming sort of dedicated to minorities. I think that if the Commission came up with like a group of characteristics that it wants to actually have these stations to do, like, whether like it used to have in terms of whether it want to have a jazz format or classical format, et cetera, that it wanted something more than just, hip-hop music, but something that's actually going to deal with the community. I think that may be one measure that would be race neutral, because it could be any broadcaster that would do it, and it wouldn't necessarily be the race of the broadcaster. I worry about sort of the small business, the new entrants, because I think that's too amorphous and won't necessarily get at what you're trying to get at, and it's another way that you might have subterfuge in some way, where you might have people who are posing as small businesses or posing as new entrants when they're really not.
I would agree with the comments about diversity of format. That can certainly be viewed as a race-neutral way of looking at things. Drawing back on my analogy between broadcasting and a law school class, we don't necessarily want all of the stations in a market to be all rock, or we don't want all the stations to be jazz. There are public interest benefits to having a variety of different types of formats in the market. And I think that perhaps the FCC could take that as a consideration more heavily, or weighted it more heavily in awards of licenses, in license renewal. For instance, did a licensee say they were going to do this, and did they actually do that, or did they change their format, or and take those things into consideration? A variety of formats, and taking into consideration that there might be some First Amendment issues to deal with when you're talking about dictating or holding a licensee to a particular format. However, there might be, and it might be an easier hurdle to clear to deal with the First Amendment issue than it is apparently to deal with the race issue.
This has been very helpful. I think we're almost out of time, but I guess I'd give the panelists an opportunity to pop in with any short comments about, or questions that they think that we haven't covered here. Does anybody have anything burning additional they want to say?
I did have just one thing that didn't necessarily come up in our discussion about the constitutional issues, and perhaps exploring the issue simply of integration, if we were to draw analogies with education. It seems as if many of the school policies are based in this notion of simply integrating the schools, and perhaps there might be something to be borrowed from that sentiment as well.
Is there, on that point, is there something, I think the difficulty with that argument, or the rejection that the courts have raised to that argument generally, is that there's no stopping point, but is there something unique about media and broadcasting that can distinguish it from any number of other important industries? After all, we only have jurisdiction really over broadcasters. Would you say that we can draw the line at broadcasters without accepting the idea that integration is good throughout society?
We might equate it with education. The court seems to think that education is so important. Diversity and voices in our democracy is essentially important to who we are as a country. I think it's very different from transportation and construction and things like that, because the media just holds such an important role in our country, in our society.
Dr. Byerly, you can have the last word.
Yeah, well, I don't know if it needs to be the last word, but I just thought it would draw together some of the ideas that several of us seem to be voicing. I know I did in my initial comments about the need for some kind of clearer guidelines on the part of the FCC so that licensees would know really what's expected of them in terms of public interest. And I'd like to go back to those 14 criteria that we abandoned, which we used to have. And they included things like opportunities for local self-expression, development and use of local talent, programs for children, editorials by licensees, news and weather, service to minority groups. The list is longer than that. Canada is also working toward these kinds of criteria. So I think that there are lots of possibilities out there that could be very constructive.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody, panelists. And Bill, you want to close out the session?
Yes, I just want to add my thanks to all the panelists and to Jake for a very stimulating discussion. We'll now take a 15-minute break and then proceed with our second panel. Thanks very much. Welcome back, everyone. If we could all take our seats, we'll get started with our second panel of the day. Our second panel will focus more specifically on the intersection between the Commission's media ownership rules and our policies of promoting diversity in broadcasting. It will be moderated by Tom Reed, who's the director of our Office of Communications Business Opportunities. And I'll just turn it over to Tom to introduce his panelists.
Thank you, Bill. Good morning or good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone, our panelists and our guests, to the FCC's second media ownership panel on minority and female ownership. We're here because the Commission is reviewing its media ownership rules to determine if they are necessary in the public interest as a result of competition, and to determine whether or not to repeal or modify any regulation it determines to be no longer in the public interest. It's my privilege to introduce our distinguished panelists for this morning's discussion of the FCC's role in framing regulatory policy that best enables diverse owners, female and minority owners, to be a vital part of our media and telecommunications industries. With us are Faith Batista, who is the Executive Director of Mabuhay Alliance, David Honig, who is the Executive Director of MMTC, the Minority Media and Telecommunications Council, Michael Roberts, Chairman and CEO of the Roberts Broadcasting Companies, and Sylvia Strobel, who is the Interim President of the American Women in Radio and Television. Ms. Batista is the founder and Executive Director of Mabuhay Alliance, a national Pan-Asian American empowerment organization that emphasizes business opportunities and diversity as key elements of corporate responsibility. Mabuhay Alliance has 6 offices in California and Nevada and will be opening a DC office on February 15. Ms. Batista meets regularly with the CEOs of 36 corporations on diversity issues, including Asian Americans on boards of directors and technical assistants and lending to grow Asian American businesses. Recent Fortune 500 CEO meetings include AT&T, Verizon, Bank of America, Citigroup, Wells Fargo, U.S. Bancorp, Edison, and Sempra. She meets regularly on diversity issues, on Asian American entrepreneurial opportunities with the chairs of the FTC, Federal Reserve, FDIC, and OCC. Ms. Batista sits on the advisory board for OTS, California Public Utilities Commission, and Sempra. She's the author of numerous articles on Asian American empowerment and is frequently interviewed on Asian American diversity issues by both mainstream and minority media. She was the 2009 recipient of the 100 Most Influential Filipinas in America.
Thank you. That's what's wrong about be, because you'll always be the first one to be called. Thank you for having me. No regulatory body is in better position than the FCC to advance the interests of this nation's 110 minorities, including our very diverse 15 million Asian Americans. Asian American GDP exceeds $600 billion. Our educational attainments, measured by college degrees, far exceed that of the populace as a whole. Similarly, our median income levels are almost 20% higher than of the general population. And our entrepreneurial skills and spirit have been displayed across the world. Yet, only 1 in 10 Fortune 500 corporations has even one Asian Americans on its board of directors. One of more than 6,000 board members of Fortune 500 corporations, we have identified only 2 Filipino Americans, just 2 Vietnamese Americans, and less than a handful of Korean Americans. Is there, for example, any major media conglomerate that has a Filipino American or Vietnamese American on its board? In positive contrast, President Obama has appointed 3 Asian Americans to his cabinet. This example of the lack of diversity at Fortune 500 corporations reflects in a nutshell the disconnect between Asian American entrepreneurial spirit and ability in its media ownership level. I would like to offer a few observations. From the Asian American perspective, first, I would like to explain how a poor and relatively uneducated girl from the Philippines got involved in this major issue. One of our most respected media corporations, Walt Disney, through its ABC network, has a highly rated TV show called Desperate Housewives. 2.5 years ago, a lead character in Desperate Housewives, Susan Mayer, played by Terry Hatcher, questioned her doctor's credentials and said, "Can I check those diplomas because I want to make sure that they're not from med school in the Philippines?" And that's ouch. Within a week, thousands of Filipino Americans contacted me, and almost 200,000 sent emails to ABC Walt Disney protecting this egregious slur on our 200,000 Filipino American nurses and doctors. Many believe this slur also was intended to discredit the educational achievements of the Philippine nation and the 4 million Filipino Americans in this country. Over 100 organizations and medical professionals assembled and asked me to help prevent this from happening again. In part, this is why I have personally met with Chairman Janikowski and Commissioner Baker, Clyburn, and Copps. And this is why we're opening an office in Washington, D.C. on February 15th. For specific answers to many of the questions we have been asked to address, I would like to draw in part of my experience at meeting with the CEOs at Fortune 500 corporations. And in part, I would like to draw on my experiences in trying to seek credit for entrepreneurial opportunities for the Asian American community through my meetings with Federal Reserve Chairman Bernanke, FDIC Chairman Baer, and through meetings with the senior management of Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Chase, Citigroup, U.S. Bancorp, and medium-sized banks such as Union Bank, Bank of the West, and East West Bank. Ordinarily, competition, not consolidation, is the best way to ensure the entrepreneurial minorities, including relatively new immigrant minorities, have access to media ownership. However, if a white-owned media giant was committed to using its resources to promote media ownership, we would look favorably upon this. But as the data I have set forth to you on Asian Americans on boards of directors demonstrates, this is rare. But this could change if this commission evaluated acquisitions and service changes through the prism of diversity. That is, ask every major media corporation diversity questions. Who is in your board of directors? Who is part of your senior management? Whom do you do business with? And what efforts are you making through technical assistance and capacity building to enhance minority media ownership? The increasingly rapid technological changes in communications that are occurring clearly demonstrate the potential for far greater minority media ownership. AT&T and Verizon in small ways have demonstrated this through multi-million-dollar commitments to technical assistance and capacity building for minority-owned businesses. One day soon, with encouragement from this commission, it is possible that Google, Intel, Microsoft, Cisco, Apple, Amazon.com, and other technology leaders will do the same. Your first chance may be the pending Comcast NBC Universal acquisition. Why not require minority diversity plan? And I'll speak more of that in the questions and answers. Using a merger to help encourage minority media ownership does have precedence. In 2005, our organization, Mabuhay Alliance, opposed the SBC acquisition of AT&T and the Verizon acquisition of MCI until they made major commitments to diversity. Both have done so, and both have prospered. Concerns about the lack of minority media ownership could be addressed partly through rules that encourage behavioral change. This could make diversity part of their DNA of all corporations that are subject to FCC, FTC, and Department of Justice jurisdiction. Recently, for example, AT&T testified before the California Public Utilities Commission that diversity was part of the DNA. Many opportunities exist to promote minority and women ownership in seemingly wide range of proceedings. This includes various FCC proceedings such as expanding spectrum and expanding broadband usage. I asked our director, DC office, to meet with your staff once our office opens to explore some of these opportunities. Current economic conditions adversely affect minority media ownership since credit requirements and lending to small and medium-sized companies have been substantially curtailed. We would favor an allocation of up to 1% of the $260 billion unused TARP funds to be allocated for low or no interest loans to enhance minority media ownership. Your Diversity Committee recommends that the FCC implements outreach program relating to investing in minority and women ownership. This is an excellent idea. We would be willing to co-host with this commission an outreach program sponsored by the major financial institutions. This could include banks that already lend to the entertainment industry, such as City National Bank. In conclusion, this commission is in a unique position to change corporate DNA. A first step would be to hold a diversity conference in Hollywood this summer attended by all commissioners, invite a broad array of media, both regulated and unregulated, and invite leaders for 110 minorities to discuss the future view of diversity in America. This Hollywood conference could hopefully lead to individual meetings with the leadership from Black, Hispanic, and media organizations to positively change the diversity of both media ownership and media portrayals of minorities. Thank you.
Thank you, Faith. Our next panelist is David Honig. David Honig co-founded the Minority Media and Telecommunications Council in 1986. MMTC currently represents over 70 minority, civil rights, and religious national organizations in selected proceedings before the FCC and other agencies, and it operates the nation's only full-service minority-owned media and telecom brokerage. David serves MMTC as President and Executive Director and as General Counsel of the Broadband Opportunity Coalition, through which the nation's leading civil rights organizations advance broadband adoption, literacy, and ownership diversity. David has practiced communications and civil rights law since 1983, specializing in electronic redlining and race discrimination cases. He has taught and written extensively about issues in the intersection between civil rights and international and domestic communications. The National Law Journal has named David one of the 30 most influential communications lawyers. David chairs the Constitutional Issues Subcommittee of the FCC Advisory Committee on Diversity for Communications in the Digital Age, and he serves pro bono as Special Counsel for Civil Rights for the Florida State Conference of the NAACP. He holds a BA in Math from Oberlin College, an MS in Systems Analysis from the University of Rochester, and a law degree, cum laude, from Georgetown University. David.
Tom, thank you so much. I want to talk about four things: why minority ownership is so important, what the status of it is now, its impact on consolidation, and what can be done to improve it. We often speak of minority ownership and diversity in the same voice, and that is important, but people often forget that the ability of all citizens to fully monetize and make use of their inherent creative, managerial, and technical skills is critical to not just to diversity, but to efficiency and competitiveness. In 2003, when we last had an opportunity to address this in comments, the last quadrennial that we had, we said, in the electronic media, a key input into production is the quality and diversity of the ownership pool consisting of the companies whose management teams, business plans, talent, and creativity are the basis for organizing and deploying all other inputs to production. The diversity of the ownership pool is an especially critical input in broadcasting, for which business creativity so often translates into ability to attract creative people to the line staff and manage them effectively. And of course, in terms of diversity, we can't overemphasize the criticality of minority ownership for what the Commission is really about, promoting diversity of voices. We said in 2003 in the docket at that time, minority owners tend to predominate in niche formats on standalone stations, thereby further promoting content diversity. The viewpoints of minorities, including the diversity of viewpoints held within minority communities, can enrich public discourse, reduce stereotyping, and unify the nation. You've heard this morning about the study that Al Hammond, Kathy Sandoval, and I did last year on the status of minority ownership, and I wanted to just cite you a few of the findings that give an overview of what minority broadcasters contribute in terms of diversity. A majority of minority-owned commercial radio broadcasters air minority formats. 75% of minority-owned stations broadcast Spanish, urban news, Asian, ethnic, and minority-oriented religious formats such as gospel and Spanish Christian. We concluded that the correlation between minority radio ownership and diversity in program service is robust. This pattern of a nexus between minority radio ownership and content has been repeated for more than 30 years. 75% of minority commercial radio owners actively chose these formats absent any government compulsion to do so. And drilling down deeper, 36% of minority-owned commercial radio stations broadcast Spanish formats, 17% urban or African American formats, including urban news and talk, and 3% Asian formats. Pew, just 2 weeks ago, the Pew Research Center released a study on African American uses of media, and it's interesting to note that notwithstanding the purported death of radio, here's what they found. 28% of African Americans regularly read black websites and blogs, 30% read black newspapers, 60% read black magazines, 62% regularly listen to black news or talk radio. So it's not dead. Now, what are the statistics in terms of a photograph? We found in this study that minority ownership of commercial radio has gone down from 2007, when Free Press pegged it at 7.78% to 7.24% in just 2 years. 3% or less of television stations, and it ought to be noted that these numbers, as atrocious as they are, disguise the fact that less than 1% of industry asset value is minority-owned radio and television stations. One reason for that is that a significant majority of minority commercial owners control only one station. In fact, only 3 minority broadcasters control more than 25 commercial radio stations in 2009. Now, what's the impact of consolidation? The GAO did a report in 2008 that identified 3 primary barriers to minority ownership as being large scale of ownership, lack of access to capital, and repeal of the tax certificate, and its findings on consolidation are very important to note, and I'll just quote them. They interviewed 56 people. 36 of them who mentioned barriers to ownership reported that the consolidation of broadcast ownership had been detrimental for minority and women owners in several important ways. First, few stations are made available for purchase, limiting opportunities for the entry of new owners such as minorities and women. Second, incumbent owners may prefer to trade stations with other incumbent owners rather than sell stations. Given the limited ownership by minority and women today, trading does little to expand their ownership. Third, when stations become available for sale, investors and other financing entities prefer multiple station purchases rather than single-station purchases in order to capture economies of scale. Like trading, such transactions favor incumbent companies that are well established over new entrants, such as minorities and women. Lastly, the scale of the industry affects the viability of current and prospective minority and women owners, since these owners must often compete with large conglomerate owners with sizable market share and greater resources. As we said last time we commented on this in 2003, consolidation can magnify the influence of past discrimination on radio ownership. Past discrimination has left minorities with insufficient broadcast assets to form an equity base from which they can acquire more properties. And of course, underlying that is the well-known gap in wealth, which still for African Americans and Hispanics stands at about 5.5 to 6 to 1. And it's with wealth that you get friends and family money and are able to grow in the business. We also found that in our experience through our media brokerage, it's rare for a station to be sold to a new entrant in competition with the company that can consolidate vertically or horizontally. The investment community will regard the station as worth more if it's sold to the consolidator. Consequently, an in-market competitor will almost always prevail against an out-of-market company or a new entrant in a bidding contest to purchase an in-market station. We also pointed out that as consolidation proceeds, eventually there simply are no more assets in play for which small and minority entrepreneurs can bid competitively against larger companies, and that after deregulation, many minority-owned incumbent broadcasters will come under intense pressure from their investors to sell to consolidators. Now, what can be done about this? I'm going to save for questions some of the other barriers to entry and barriers to success that we know of very well: discrimination in advertising, the risk of performance royalty being imposed, of course, the state of the economy, the loss of advertising revenue, competition from other platforms, and Adarand that we've already heard about, and the demise of the tax certificate that we're still trying to get back. We have before the Commission, on our own behalf and on behalf of some 30 national organizations, a couple dozen proposals to advance minority ownership, both on reconsideration and also through comments in the last quadrennial proceeding that are still pending. And also in the form of the MMTC radio rescue petition, which contains 17 mostly engineering recommendations to foster minority ownership. But there's 3 in particular I want to point out that are really big picture items. One of these really is appropriate to address in this new quadrennial review, which is that around the edges of the rules, which the Commission often focuses on, perhaps in some instances, a particular type of transaction, such as incubating a minority or woman owner getting into a market that's tough to get into, might justify a waiver of a rule where a company, a large company, is already bumping up against a limit of how many stations it can acquire in that market. This has to be done very carefully, and it needs to be limited, and certainly it has to be cost-benefit justified. But sometimes it can be, and the Commission ought to consider it. That incubation proposal is not new. It was first advanced by us and NABOB in 1990. Commission put it out for comment in 1992, and it is now in its 5th docket, waiting to see if there will be a vote on it. Second is, as discussed in this last panel, the adoption of full file review so that there's something a little less dilute than just the small business criteria, but would still be race neutral and would pass scrutiny under rational basis, to focus more clearly the benefit of Commission initiatives and programs on minorities and women. And third is the big engineering picture of what's going to happen to AM radio. 2/3 of minority-owned commercial radio stations are AM stations, and of course you can't pick them up in some areas very well at all for reasons all of us who studied engineering know. In the digital age, they could get left behind. Only 4% of young people listen to them. Oh my goodness, are we going to lose minority ownership, 2/3 of it, if we lose AM radio? We propose, as has the Broadcast Maximization Committee, and Jack Mullaney, who originally filed this, our engineer, the exodus of most AM stations to what is now channels 5 and 6, and their conversion into FM facilities. That we would estimate, triple the asset value of minority-owned radio the minute it happened. We've recommended that we take the same approach to this as the Commission very wisely took in 1987 to DTV, which is to form a federal advisory committee, get all of the people in the room who are stakeholders and some of whom think this can't possibly work because we disagree with each other too much, get them in the room, close the door, and don't let them out until we fix it.
Thank you, David. Our next guest is Mr. Michael Roberts. Michael is the author of Action Has No Season, Strategies and Secrets to Gaining Wealth and Authority. Over the past 30-plus years, he has amassed a business empire that includes 3 full-power television stations. He serves or has served on the board of directors of the International Council of Shopping Centers, the National Association of Black Hotel Owners, Operators and Developers, the National Association, Michael is the recipient of numerous awards such as the 2009 Trumpet Award for Business, the 2007 Ernst & Young Entrepreneur of the Year Award, the Morehouse College Distinguished Leader Award. He's been a participant in some of our country's most prestigious programs, the Citizen Ambassador Program, Securities Delegation to China in '96, the Army War College in 2001, the Joint Civilian Orientation Conference, trip to South America in 2008. Roberts Broadcasting Company was founded in 1989 by Michael and his brother Steve and is licensee for WRBU TV, Channel 46 in St. Louis, Missouri, the first African-American owned full-power television station to enter the St. Louis market in over 20 years. WRBU is an affiliate of Fox-owned My Network TV. WRBU broadcasts to over 2.5 million viewers in the St. Louis ADI. Michael received his Juris Doctorate degree from St. Louis University in 1974. Michael.
Thank you. Good morning. I think that in the interest of the Commission, perhaps with the number of skeletons we've heard today, it's time for someone to actually place some meat on those skeletons and give you statements that are much more anecdotal than perceived as being possible rule changes, even though I will proffer some of those this morning as well. As stated in the introduction, my brother Steve and I started our company, our broadcast side of our company in 1981. We became an applicant for a full-power UHF station in St. Louis. At the time, you had rules that preferred minority applicants. We were approached by a consultant. We had very little understanding of the process, even though we both took courses in our respective colleges and actually had radio shows and did a few of the internships that one might do as a course of matriculating in the universities. So we told the consultant, yes, let's go for it. And then they proceeded to share with us how to identify a law firm, an engineering firm, and make application. We thought, well, we would be in pretty good shape. As African Americans, my brother and I were both city councilmen, we were businessmen, so we were going to be involved in the day-to-day operations of our station, as well as be able to bring to our community notable points of interest based on the type of programming we would have at that time. Well, everything was going fine until 7 other applicants, all of whom claimed to be minorities, applied against us. It then took until 1989 before we actually went on the year from 1981. At the time, we weren't rich, we weren't poor, but we never had any money. So we had to find our way through creative ways of setting up our various other businesses to fund the process that you had before all applicants at the time. Shortly after that, of course, we ultimately won, and then we became very aggressive. We then bought a license in Denver, and then Raleigh-Durham, Nashville. We kept going, and we ended up applicants and winning licenses in Albuquerque and a few other locations, Salt Lake City to be specific. And as we began to develop this model of full-power TV station ownership, some of which were just licenses and unable to find financing, we had to spin and look at other choices. About that time, there was an emerging company, Acme Communications, who was looking to start a broadcast group using the CW as their base programming. We ended up striking a relationship, and I think we placed I believe, 3 of our stations into that mix. At the same time, Paxton was expanding, and we sold 2 or 3 of our stations to Paxton. Why? To raise money to build some of our other activities. But right about that same time, you were coming out with the concept of digital phones. And there was going to be this tremendous auction process, and we decided that since we were so familiar with the FCC that we would actually get into the phone business. Why not? So as a result of capitalizing that process, we again sold off some of our stations, and at the same time we were merging to create a public company with some of our stations while keeping other stations like Denver and St. Louis in play within our own family of businesses. In those particular 2 stations, we were able to produce local programming, an In Your Interest show, for example, or the Mike and Jeannie show, shows that brought young people to our station to watch us out of curiosity, if nothing else, because they were interested in seeing, well, what is this all about? And it was working pretty well. When we decided to go into the broadband side of things and pursue the auctions for our digital phone business, we actually ended up winning several. Our first process or concept was to bid on licenses around the cities where we own TV stations. So this is sharing with you why ownership in one segment of your area, FCC, can expand the prospects of additional opportunities within the control of the FCC. Now, what we found was we had a model. We realized that if we were going to build a phone company, we would have our TV station as a form of advertising, to promote it, to have people to build it. We were pretty naive at the time. We thought maybe that would be the way to do it. And actually, I guess it is. Unfortunately, we were outbid by many of the others. You see, we were in the C and F blocks, the blocks that were set up for designated entities. And we thought that was pretty cool. When you started it off, it was women and minorities. And then suddenly you had to change it to small business. But when you change it to small business, you define business as doing less than $50 million a year. So I'm not sure that you gave us any advantage as a result of that, because you ended up allowing for rural phone companies to compete with us. Nevertheless, we prevailed in the greater St. Louis area. We then met with Sprint. We became a Sprint affiliate. We ultimately built our facility. The financing at that time was vendor financing, something that most of us normally wouldn't know about. But we discovered that there was a thing called vendor financing. That's where, in this case, the vendors of the product actually lent us the $53 million to build. We built, then we merged with some of the other Sprint affiliates. We ultimately became Roberts Wireless, and then Alamosa, then Sprint rolled us up. And being rolled up after we went public and were bought by them, the wonderful sound of a roll-up is cha-ching, cha-ching. That led to us looking back at the broadcast side, and then we looked at your auctions for some of your TV stations. Now you'd eliminated the process that we were accustomed to, but fortunately we learned the auction process. The result was we ended up buying stations in Jackson, Mississippi, licenses for Jackson, Mississippi, and Columbia, South Carolina, and we use our own money to build those stations. Then we bought Evanston, Indiana. Today there are only about 8 African-American-owned television stations left in this country. We own 4 of them. We also own a radio station that we bought that was owned by an African-American. He had about 4 of them. He went into bankruptcy. So we decided we would buy the one in Jackson, Mississippi, just to explore the prospect of having a radio station and TV station combo in the same market, pursuing the African-American community primarily. And that became a very interesting product. It's still it's an effort that we're continuing to work with, but it's coming along. I know I'm running short of time, so I want to just throw out a few other quick points. You have must-carry provisions for those of us who are in the TV station ownership. I urge you to consider strongly to make certain that all of our digital channel opportunities are protected under must-carry provisions. I'm going to suggest that any of us who are remaining, who are minority in ownership, that recognizing the turn of the economy, that you give us a chance to have a holiday or a moratorium on paying fees to you. give us a chance to hold that money back so that we can engage in the appropriate type of programming costs. Now, for our stations, we actually air a large number of minority and predominantly African American type programming. Now, many of those programmings have had challenges because advertisers, our main advertisers, are automobile dealerships. Well, we know what they've been like for the last 18 months. So all of these pressures are upon us. So we look for considerations. For example, you've asked us to convert to digital in 2009, and there was no money for it. So I'd take a small station like in Evansville where it cost $2.5 million. Instead of being able to build it, what I did was drop a digital signal over my city of license. I worked with the great guy here, Clay Pendarvis, who worked so hard to make sure that we stay alive. And what we found was through Muskerry, and because we central cast all of our stations out of St. Louis, meaning we send our signal up on a satellite and bring it down, we could then, through Muskerry, go into the cable head ends in that community, and that way it was considerably less money. But we still are looking to ultimately be able to do it in a more traditional way. Tax credits toward the historic tax credits have always been something that we've used in developing. We own about 3 city blocks of downtown St. Louis, and we take old buildings and convert them. If you could take, for example, the cost of our programming and the cost of our build-outs and give us tax credits that we could then in turn sell and bring cash into our provisions, into our properties, it could make quite the difference for us ultimately. There's a variety of others that are in my written proposal to you this morning. I know we're short of time. I just want to conclude by saying, we are the last African-American group owner of TV stations that are currently existing. Let's hope that we truly are not going to be the last ones and that we can find ways to aggressively find new pursuits to bring a variety of ownership. And I might add on the employee side of things, our stations are all run by a woman, and I would say 98% of our employees are women and are minorities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Our next guest is Sylvia Strobel. Sylvia is a senior partner in the entertainment law firm Lehman Strobel PLC. She has served as an attorney and business advisor to the media and entertainment communities for 20 years. In addition to founding Lehman Strobel PLC in '96, she has served as president and general manager of the Pennsylvania Public Television Network and as an attorney and business affairs specialist for Twin Cities Public Television, Minneapolis, St. Paul, in the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Her education includes a BA in biology at St. Olaf College, a JD at William Mitchell College of Law, and a master's in business administration from the University of Minnesota. She's a 2001 graduate of the NAB Educational Foundation's Broadcast Leadership Training Program. Sylvia is currently serving as interim president of American Women in Radio and Television and will return to her position as chair of the AWRT National Board of Directors in March.
Thank you. On behalf of American Women in Radio and Television, I want to thank you for inviting us to participate in this workshop today. My name is Sylvia Strobel, and I'm the interim president of AWRT. Prior to stepping into this role in October, I was a member of the National Board of Directors of AWRT for 8 years, and most recently served as chair. AWRT is proud of its 59-year history. It was formed in 1951 as a successor to the National Association of Broadcasters Women's Division. NAB approved the new organization, offering complete cooperation and assistance. The following year, more than 280 women gathered to celebrate and approve the structure of AWRT. We have grown our membership immensely since its founding, and we have 19 professional chapters throughout the United States. Our members are quite diverse in age, work experience, and job duties. AWRT local chapters provide members with a local forum for personal and professional development and enhance leadership, public speaking, and group decision-making skills. The mission of AWRT is to advance the interests of women in media and allied fields by educating, advocating, and acting as a resource to our members, the industry, and the public at large. One of our key goals is to promote the entry, development, advancement, and retention of women in the media industry. AWRT continues to evolve to meet the needs of its members in a changing media landscape. and serves as a partner, resource, and educational service provider to the media industry at large. Ongoing initiatives include government and regulatory advocacy, employment information services, professional development programs, and industry updates. Two new initiatives undertaken by AWRT headquarters over the last few years include a new student chapter program and a mentoring program. Both are geared to increasing the number of women entering the media industry, as well as providing career advancement opportunities. AWRT currently has 8 student chapters, with several more student chapters in development. Our student chapters include Georgia State, Spelman College, George Washington University, Lyndon State, Howard University, Montclair State University, Penn State University, and Central Michigan University. Our student members are recognized through our annual Gracie's Awards and offered scholarships to attend AWRT educational events, like our annual Women's Media Forum, which is held here in D.C. every March. Where possible, students are paired with professional AWRT chapters and/or members for additional career development guidance. AWRT's mentorship program was developed nearly 4 years ago to pair senior-level AWRT members in the media industry with emerging professionals. Mentoring is a powerful tool that is critical to the advancement of women, as well as to the success of the broadcast companies and the media industry as a whole. Not only does it play a significant role in the development of an individual's career, it helps companies enhance the skills of their employees and diversity of their workplace. AWRT's student chapter program and membership program are critical if we are to provide meaningful employment and advancement opportunities for women in the media industry. Furthermore, the number of women in management or ownership in the media industry is still small, and programs like those offered by AWRT can provide a direct link to increase the number of women in executive roles, serving on corporate boards, and owning media companies. We have all seen the dismal numbers. Too few women hold senior management positions in broadcast companies, and only 5% of television stations and 6% of radio stations are owned by women. Few women serve on the boards of Fortune 500 media companies or hold a position of CEO. When drilling down to mid-sized companies, the number of women holding leadership or ownership positions is still relatively small. It is difficult to reconcile these numbers when realizing that more women than men have been graduating with bachelor's degrees since the 1980s, which reflects most of the workforce under the age of 50. AWRT will continue to advocate on behalf of its membership in the media industry to change these facts and figures and increase opportunities for women through proactive, productive, and measurable programs and incentives. We are pleased to be invited to participate in the workshop and provide our suggestions and recommendations for improving the opportunities for women in the media industry. We would ask that the FCC weigh changes to the current media ownership rules that take into account any disparate impact of such change on women's ability to purchase stations and/or be a part of the purchasing station's senior management teams. Where possible, we also respectfully request that women's access to capital to purchase stations be thoroughly reviewed, with the understanding that the majority of station purchases, including stations in small markets and rural areas, generally exceed SBA guaranteed loan amounts and are not well received by local or regional lenders or investors who have little experience evaluating broadcast properties. We realize that the current economy and evolution of digital technology has had a profound impact on the broadcast industry, and that any changes made to the media ownership rules must account for many factors. AWRT certainly does not promote changes that hinder the broadcasting industry's ability to evolve, compete, and continue to provide key services, particularly to local markets. However, we do recommend due diligence, research, and where possible, specific programs that provide resources and financing options for women seeking to advance in the media industry or invest in media properties. AWRT is willing and able to provide assistance, research, outreach, and training in support of the FCC's work in this regard. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for your comments, and thank you again for being here to lend us your expertise. I'd sort of like to start this off. I think we're going to be getting questions from the audience, and I believe we'll get questions from the internet as well. But let me start it off with something that you've all alluded to. Yesterday we held a workshop here, roundtable discussion on broadband strategies for minority radio. And one of the consensus opinions was that, in effect, there's a perfect storm here for minorities in broadcasting. the recessionary market, as you refer to the after effects of consolidation, multi-platform competition, the exodus of ad dollars to internet media outlets, and as Michael alluded to, the cost of the DTV transition. All of those factors have really hammered at minority broadcasters. So my first question is in that context, looking at our media ownership rules, our current media ownership rules, what effect do those rules have on minority and female ownership in broadcasting? And I'll just put that out to the panel. Or as Jake did in the prior panel, we'll start first with you, Faith.
I'm going to change my last name to Zautista. No, obviously, we will not have this hearing if the rules were favorable. I, as a minority, immigrant, for us to watch the news in the Philippines, we have to pay $79 a month to get that cable. And for us to even be part of the media, we got to be part of a big media like Verizon, which they require so much requirements. So therefore, it's only the last 4 years actually that the Filipino channel has been out in the United States, and the other media, which is the GMA, it's only been last year. And there are 4 million Filipinos in the United States who wants to see the news in the Philippines, cannot even have that access until they pay so much the cable. With the crisis right now, the foreclosure crisis. It's so funny that we do foreclosure prevention counseling, and the last budget they will remove is that cable, because that is very important to them. That is their stress reliever from all the crisis that they have. Even they lost a job, and that's just, I'd rather lose my manicure, pedicure. Don't take that cable away from me. So I'm just really hoping, and this is why I got involved really with FCC, is how can we increase that ownership? And I mentioned I've been involved in the supplier diversity. And I think if FCC can start the supplier diversity, and 2 years, 4 years from now, eventually there will be an increase of ownership. I always in favor of the first-tier, second-tier supplier. The reason why I mentioned some of the utility companies' success is because the California Public Utilities Commission, the President PV, made it part of their DNA that supplier diversity has got to be part of corporate responsibility. So therefore, business ownership starts to flourish from there. If FCC can do the same thing, I'm more on the result-oriented, and I'm here speaking as a grassroots, speaking really for the small businesses, especially the women of color. There is really no chance or little chance for them to gain access to these resources.
Others have a reaction. Sylvia?
We all know that the number of women and minorities owning stations is very small, so clearly whatever we've been doing has not been working. But the question I had when I was thinking through this in preparation for this workshop, is it the current rules or is it the business practices that need to change? We can relax the rules, we can tighten the rules, we can keep them as is. I'm not sure that's really going to solve the problem of women and minorities buying stations or moving into senior management ranks unless we actually look at coming up with some solutions and recommendations for changing the business practices that currently exist.
Okay.
Yep. I'm going to comment. I'm going to use an experience. When we were in the auction to buy the last couple of TV stations we bought within 10 years ago. There's an attribution rule. Because I served on a board of a publicly held company that owned about 11 stations, you had a rule that said we can give you a 25% discount on your bid if you are a minority, or whatever your definition at the time was. It seems to have always been a moving target, designated entity. I mean, I don't know what you are, what we are today based on your changing terms. But at the time, you allowed that. Well, we owned 2 TV stations, and the requirement was arbitrarily 3. And if you own more than 2, you would not be eligible for that 25% discount in the auction. Well, we started the auction, and because I was a board member, I was attributed to having 11 stations. So I had to resign from that position. But the timing of my resignation came subsequent to the beginning of the bidding process. So even though I was not on the board at the time we won, and it was time for us to be determined the owner, the competing entity decided that they were going to challenge the rule. And you guys punted on me. And basically, instead of getting that 25% discount, which was over $2 million to work with us, you suggested that I just define myself as if I owned 3 stations at the time, and I wasn't any longer eligible, and then I had to write that extra $2 million check in order to get it, and I did it. But I felt that you turned your backs on the opportunity to make sure that African Americans would have owned stations in some very unique markets, specifically Jackson, Mississippi, and Columbia, South Carolina. But we prevailed. We went on. We paid up, and as a result, you know, we are on the air now. So I'm going to suggest that from time to time that you put your money where your mouth is. That you, in fact, get out here and do the best you can to help those of us who are trying to make it work. And you know, I was a former alderman, and in the political world, there's an old phrase. To our enemies, we follow the rules. To our friends, we'll do anything necessary. And I'm going to suggest that you start looking more closely at yourself to determine where your rules are and what you can do to interpret them to help us succeed in the future.
David?
There's so much that the Commission can complain about but can't do anything about. It can't do much about the economy, at least directly. It can't do much about competition from other platforms, at least directly. But there's no shortage of pending proposals gathering dust at this agency for years and sometimes decades that the Commission just lets sit and sit and sit. Due process is never afforded. They are never dusted off. And many of them are now foregone opportunities. I could give you over 24 examples. I just want to pick a few. The Commission adopted EEO rules in 1971. Stopped enforcing them about 9 years ago, has had a slew of proposals about how it could begin to do that, and has done nothing. EEO rules are vital to minority ownership because that's where the talent pool comes from. We now have a situation with AM journalism. RTNDA has studied this. We've looked at their data. We pointed out a couple years ago, and are still waiting for action on this, that the percentage of minorities in radio journalism, English language radio journalism now, if you tease that out of RTNDA's figures, is less than 1%. It's where it was in 1950. There's been a purge, and the Commission has done nothing. The Commission adopted its advertising non-discrimination rule. It took us 24 years to get that. In 2007, to this day, it doesn't have anyone on the staff to enforce it. That's more than 2 years after it adopted the rule. This is a process that is a 5 to 10% hit every year on minority broadcasters who earn money and never get to collect it. It's obscene, people. Just give you a few other examples. The tax certificate policy was repealed by Congress in 2005. Every year the Commission sends a polite letter to Congress saying it would be nice to have it back. It's common wisdom. No one opposes it. Why haven't the Commission's legislative people gone up to the Ways and Means Committee and just camped out and insisted this is vital if we're going to have this important industry survive and be diverse? This should not be hard. Why is a performance tax sitting out there as a potential hit on minority radio especially, small radio especially, and the Commission's legislative office has said nothing? This is something that could cost minority broadcasters $100 or $200 million a year, depending on who's counting. And the proposals the Diversity Committee has put before it started in 2003. 44 proposals are pending. MMTC and the Diversity and Competition supporters, 31 organizations, have, I've lost count. It's, I think, 28 or 29 pending proposals before the agency. There's some overlap. Just one example I mentioned earlier. The idea of having around the edges waivers for incubator programs, which ought to be not controversial. It's about as conservative as you get. Give someone something else, it's a win-win in exchange for them doing something for the public interest. That was proposed in 1990, and it's still sitting there. Now, that's not the fault of any one person. It's institutional failure, because this is not a priority. And boy, did it get solemn here when I said that, because we all know it's true. And yet we wake up tomorrow and nothing's going to be done about it. What do we have to do? Picket the building? I mean, it's obscene, people, and it's about time someone said what it is. Okay.
Well, it seems like we've gotten a couple ideas here: institutional inaction and some factors related to perhaps a proposal for behavioral changes in the rules. Professor Angela Campbell, just getting back to the rules for a second, said quite candidly in the prior panel that that her recommendation was for tightening of the ownership rules rather than relaxing them, and getting back to what impact the rules have on women and minority-owned businesses. That specific question, what's your opinion of whether the rules should be tightened or relaxed?
Take that one. We have to be aware of unintended consequences. There are some rules which could be tightened without having the financial markets go crazy. Sometimes it's said that when corporate America catches a cold, corporate minority America gets the flu. So we have to be very careful that people who write checks don't just decide to go in the widget business tomorrow because the expectations that they have and their business plans that were based on commission rules suddenly get thrown out the window. If the commission, for example, decided we're not going to have 8-year renewals, we're going to have 3-year renewals, that wouldn't be a bad idea. That wouldn't hurt the financial markets that much. If it said we're going to stop deregulating and freeze what we have and work around the edges, that probably wouldn't have much effect on the financial markets or on the availability of capital. If it suddenly started to require massive divestitures, that would have a short-run positive impact for those who got some of the divestitures, but it would have a greater negative impact based on money leaving the business. You'd have 100% of nothing in effect. Mm-hmm. So we have to be cautious about where and really use careful economic analysis in deciding what, if any, rules can be rolled back that relate to ownership structure. It's very difficult once you deregulate to later re-regulate ownership rules, which is another reason just to be very careful before you have deregulation at all.
Anyone else?
I was just going to say, I agree with David 100%. I think the more data that we can collect through this process, the better. I think we heard from the prior panel, and some of us on this panel were talking about the fact of the lack of data and real measurements on the impact of some of these ownership rules. But I think the thing that we all agree on is we don't want to take action and have it negatively impact the broadcasting industry so that it can no longer compete. That's not going to help women or minorities buy stations, and it's going to result in a lot of job loss among our colleagues.
Sylvia, you said earlier, and correct me if I'm mistaken in quoting you, essentially you talked about business practices, and we're talking about ownership structure, but it seemed that you were alluding to the fact that maybe behavioral changes in the rules would be more effective. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Michael brought up one really good example and that probably gets more at some of the rules than anything. But I know David has mentioned this too, creating some incentives that change the behavior of companies, particularly media companies and broadcasters, so that they have more incentive to invest in or provide resources to women or minorities who are looking to buy stations. I know there are some examples out there of some creative financing that's going on to assist women and minorities buy stations, but we need to see a lot more of this. And in the current economic environment, it's very difficult for most of the large stations to get the financing they need right now to just maintain operations. It's virtually impossible for a new entrant to get the financing. So the more incentives we can create to change behavior and change current business practices so that it promotes women and minorities owning stations, owning a percentage of a station. It may not be 51%, but having some kind of ownership and management authority of a station, I think the better. That's how we're going to get from where we are to where we need to be.
I agree with you. Basically, we're trying to create a voice to the community. I mean, that's really what it's all about. It's a visual and it's an audio voice to the community that delivers entertainment, news, etc. Now, one of the questions that I would ask of you is to consider perhaps changing your foreign ownership rules. Frankly, if you look at who might take an interest in investing in our community, it won't be just the special interest Australian that you allowed to have this happen to, but maybe people from China and the Philippines and some other places that have emerging large capital funds, which in fact, at some point if they become citizens here, then we have that opportunity and we're ahead of the game. That might be one of our financing sources. We know that there's some challenges out here with the banks. We understand that. There's not much we can do about it. But if you allowed for that ownership rule to be expanded slightly from a foreign ownership rule to be expanded, perhaps there may be yet another option that we can place on the table for financing and frankly, minority ownership as we will define it in the future.
David?
I want to underscore two very important points that Mike Roberts has made. On the subject of foreign ownership, we don't have those. The Commission has authority to decide case by case that the public interest is served if someone has more than 25% foreign ownership. That's what 310b-4 says. And it's been done once in the case of this gentleman in the case that I lost in 1995. I'm old enough. And I've realized that I kind of was on the wrong side of that case. I'll admit it. Because of the possibility that sources of capital unavailable or uninterested in this country might be interested elsewhere, especially from South America, from Spain, from Mexico, from the Philippines, from Japan, and that would be a great thing. We proposed, as did a large coalition of organizations, that the Commission change its foreign ownership rules to make them commensurate with the way it handles foreign ownership in the common carrier space and in the cable space. And the Commission, in a couple sentences in the last deregulation order, denied that request. We have it on reconsideration, and it has been sitting there on reconsideration for almost 2 years. And this is one of the 3 or 4 most significant things the Commission could do to jumpstart access to capital for minorities in this business. And it's just sitting there. Second thing, what Mr. Roberts had to say about his own arc of business diversity is such a great example. Own television stations, use that as a jumping off point to get into wireless. Everyone on the outside kind of looks at the Commission these days and thinks it's all about broadband and not about broadcasting. But this is the heritage technology that minorities and women got into the communications business with. And again, when we work in all of those spaces. In the broadband space, you'd be surprised how many people learned this business through radio operations or ownership, or television operations or ownership, or got into wireless exactly this way. That's the natural arc of technological diversity. So if you cut off access to these heritage startup industries for many people who have diversified careers, what you're doing is basically putting the agency in the position where in new industries it's going to wake up one morning and say, why isn't this diverse? Why doesn't this look like America? Because you cut off the route in.
Just the behavioral change, I always believe in going outside the box. I mentioned the technical assistance and capacity building. How about this big media creating a pilot program, creating a fund to teach how to run this business properly and how to work with FCC. I guess there's a lot of bureaucracy and very, very slow, So how can we adapt to that? So how about teaching them? So eventually they will own one and do it properly. So creating a small business technical assistance and capacity building for them.
Thank you. I've got a follow-up question on the foreign ownership issue. In the transportation context, I've done some work in the past on ownership credits or on percentage of ownership, and at least in the transportation arena, part of the concern is whether or not the percentages actually reflect real management by minorities. And if you all have any comments with respect to that, if whether the foreign ownership rules sort of impact that issue, and if there's a counter argument to it.
Do we want to have the possibility of ownership fraud involving people who aren't within our borders, or do we want to have no ownership and a little bit same percentage of ownership fraud for people within our borders? There's a long history of, the Commission has a long history. Remember from the comparative hearing days, I did a study on this about 20-something years ago, found that maybe about a third of applicants holding themselves out as minority and women-controlled applicants really weren't, but you know what? 2/3 of them were. And that was better than zero, which is what we had before the Commission started this practice. There was attrition, but the fact that something isn't perfect isn't a reason not to do it.
Anyone else?
I agree with him. Essentially, first of all, if you look at the forms of media that exist today, it's coming from all over the world anyway. Mm-hmm. All over the world. Whether it's hitting on your laptop or on your through cable TV, so when are we going to move into the global economy as the FCC? I understand the concept of people who would argue that we should build a wall between the United States and Mexico, but I don't necessarily agree that is the way to do it, nor do I agree that for us to think that the only way for us to progress in this country is to limit ourselves and restrict voice that now would be ostensibly global. And I think the natural outcome of that is that you'll have a diversity in employment, in management, and in ownership.
That actually brings me to a kind of a segue into a question that was asked in the prior panel about defining diversity. That's one of the issues that we face here, is how precisely does the Commission look at what diversity means in the marketplace? Should we be looking at it in terms of diversity as a means to an end, that being the type of content that's provided through our media outlets, or are we looking at diversity as an end in itself, diversity of ownership? I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Diversity to me is corporate responsibility, not just ownership, but also the senior management and their philanthropy and their supplier diversity. Who are their customers? The receipts that they get are usually from minority, and I think they should give back to the minority. Their senior management should be minority. And this is what I'm so passionate about. Of all the 6,000 board of directors, there are only 2 Filipinos, 2 Vietnamese, and we're the highest educated people. Where's the diversity? Diversity is not just about your color and my color. It's your DNA, your corporate responsibility, the public interest. And I'm so glad you're having this hearing, and thank you for including me, because I don't think we've never really been part of this. I encourage more of that public participation, and I'm glad Commissioner Clyburn went to San Diego, and I applaud her for that. The same thing with Commissioner Baker and Chairman Janikowski. But at the same time, they give 2-day notice. So how many people can come? It's usually either the lobbyists or the corporations. I mean, you really need to hear from the grassroots, from the community. To me, that's diversity. Include everyone. Listen to the Main Street.
David?
The question of whether it's for its own sake or to promote content diversity at the consumer level, it's both. Of course, what we want is a process by which owners who we trust under the structure of the Communications Act to ultimately control what goes over their airwaves, to be diverse, because that's going to lead, as studies have again and again shown, to diversity in terms of opinions that are available to the public, in terms of agendas of issues that get presented to the public, and in terms of diversity of culture. But more than that, let's suppose that this was an industry of common carriers. Would diversity of ownership still be important? Of course it would, because of its value in promoting efficiency and in promoting competition by allowing everyone to have an opportunity to fully monetize their inherent assets that are distributed equally among all people. That means, for example, in the way that it works in practice, I thought it was fascinating that Mr. Roberts' company, most of the employees are 98% minorities and women. Not a lot of companies can point to that. That's something that happens in the normal course in most minority and women-owned companies. It means that people wouldn't get an opportunity to work in many places at all, get this opportunity here. And it means that there's one other thing that people don't remember, and that's, you remember Andrew Brimmer's study in 1995 about the impact of discrimination on the macroeconomy? A dollar circulated in African-American communities circulates 7 times. Mm-hmm. Only twice if it is not. So it gets used to build the community as a whole, which benefits all of society immensely.
Well, I used to be an entrepreneur, and that's when you're building your companies for your family. But now I'm a solid capitalist. And as a capitalist, I'm trying to build generationally. And by building generationally in a capitalistic nation, you set examples, many examples. And those examples will be at schools where you might speak or just in the community. You see, our offices are still on Dr. Martin Luther King and King's Highway. And anybody who knows, if I use the term Dr. Martin Luther King Boulevard, they know the nature of the neighborhood just by the concept of that name. We set examples. You see our dishes on the roof of our building. I mean, I have to believe that when those students come through and they point to us as owners of our TV stations, it has to have an impact on those inner city kids when they see it. I just believe that. And I've had young people come along years later to suggest the fact that now that they're in that business, I still get calls, how do I get in the business? Now, one of the questions that I may ask of you is, if we have now turned in our analog signals, that's still spectrum out there, to what extent are you planning to make sure that women and minorities are able to activate some of that spectrum in a fashion that's going to work and make money in our capitalistic system? This is going to be an interesting challenge I'm putting to you, because you have the spectrum of every television station in the United States and our protectorates, all of those licenses and all of that spectrum. How are you going to now convert that analog spectrum to an economic model that women and minorities will be able to enjoy and exploit?
David, you alluded to this a moment ago and talking about the data that's out there on really the nexus between ownership and content diversity. Do you think that the data is there, or is there something else that we have to do to measure that nexus? And if so, what?
There have been studies on this going back. In fact, Mr. Justice Brennan's last opinion in Metro Broadcasting cites about 2 pages of those studies and footnotes and in the text of that opinion, and that was in 1989. And studies continue to be done in the Academy, and the Commission has done, I think, one in 2000, but none since. Here, if it's going to be necessary, and it will be, to defend Commission rules that may, if it finds, as I think it ultimately will have to, that some race-conscious rules are going to be necessary in order to bring us back from the brink and stop this slippage, then it's going to have to do research that is current. Courts are not going to look well at data that's based on databases 4, 5, 6 years old. So this always has to be examined again and again. Otherwise, there just won't be the record. We just went through 8 years with no research, where even longitudinal databases on minority ownership and EEO got cut off. A huge bit of wealth that the Commission had gone because someone decided in the science office of all places that it wasn't important to keep track of science anymore. Yeah, I said it. Thank goodness that's no longer the case here, but we have to institutionalize this by doing this regularly. Whenever there's a quadrennial, this ought to be studied. It's going to cost some money. Please spend it.
And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but in terms of what the agency has to do, what the Commission has to do to design the types of studies that are going to be effective going forward. You know, in the going back to the transportation context, which has been fairly aggressive. DOT has been fairly aggressive at promoting diversity studies, or of course, the case law in that area has suggested that state by state diversity studies have to be done. One measuring capacity, and that is the level of minority and female ownership in those particular jurisdictions that have the ability to do the type of work, and then looking at the history of barriers in that particular jurisdiction. I mean, what are all of your thoughts on how we should be designing studies that will equip us to face constitutional attack?
Well, the relevant market for broadcasting is national. Broadcast employment is national. People don't work in one community all their life. The average radio station runs through 55% job turnover in a year. Television, what is it, about 40, 45%? And especially after consolidation, if you lose your job somewhere, there may be only 4 or 5 other places you can go for a job, so you have to move. So I'm very confident. I know some of those studies in the transportation area where people really do work in construction in one city at one time. But if you're going to work in the radio and television industry, it's national, and I'm pretty confident the court will realize that.
Can I add on that studies? We're going to have a national broadband plan study. We're launching that in February 19th here in Washington, D.C., because we look at one study, it was like you said, 8 years ago, and study about Asian community. Well, they forgot about the Hmong, the Cambodian, the Laotian, the Filipino. They were just worried about the Chinese and the Japanese, and because of the sub-ethnic group. So I said, we got to do a really good study. So we're going to be doing that and really understand what's this national broadband, this plan, this media ownership. They don't even know what net neutrality, that alone spell net neutrality, and then they read it all the time. So I think the real study is getting the survey, finding out from different groups of people. From the students, Korea, Philippines, I think they're more high-tech than the United States. I think we're the 8th, where the United States is lowest in technology. So you can learn more from the Asian. For example, we're getting students to teach their grandpas, their uncles and aunties. Because when we do this foreclosure prevention counseling, they just say, oh, email it to my kids so we can understand it. So, I mean, we need to have really good study by asking the people and different ethnic groups. And I think FCC can really take the leadership on that one.
Sylvia?
Just piggybacking on what my colleagues have just said, too, on the national front, aside from the employment, when you're looking to be an owner, you're generally looking at a national group of stations to potentially purchase. You're rarely, if ever, going to find anything in your own backyard. So, I mean, it's truly a national process. Even, and having been through the process of looking at buying stations in the past, you're looking all over the country, you're evaluating those stations, and you're working with brokers, banks, and equity firms that are based all over the country, too. So it's truly a national process.
You mentioned brokers, banks, and equity firms, access to capital, and sort of bringing this back around to our ownership rules. What, if anything, should we be doing or looking at with respect to the ownership rules that will impact that issue, access to capital?
I've been mulling this question over because I'm not sure it's so much a rules issue as it is an education issue, particularly where the capital markets are concerned. I think there are a lot of folks in the broadcasting industry, including some big media companies, that would love to come to the table and find some solutions for diversifying the industry, including in the ownership ranks. Where I think we've seen a lot of frustration is in working with the banks and equity firms and angel investors because the broadcast model just overall no longer fits within their portfolio. And furthermore, if you're looking at folks who are trying to buy small market stations, $2, $3, $4 million for a station, they're too far under the financial requirements of most of these big national banks and equity firms, which require a $50 million deal or above. So we're looking at I think, a couple of things that really relate to the access to capital. It's education, educating banks and investment firms on the broadcasting industry. It's not the .com industry. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have incredible value and revenue potential. So I think education is key. But certainly, where the rules are concerned, if there are opportunities to work within the current broadcasting communities to come up with some solutions and suggestions and incentives that allow for those entities to provide financing, whether it be an incubator model or some kind of vendor financing or more seller financing, I think that would definitely provide an opportunity for more ownership.
I'd like to reiterate again one of my points about diversity of ownership internationally, because financial resources would be one of the primary generating factors for us to look beyond our shores to get financing to make further acquisitions. But without going offshore, let's sort of come back to Washington, D.C. just for a moment. The Small Business Administration has loan guarantees with banks. Historically, the FCC would not allow for there to be a SBA guarantee because the theory would be that if there's a recovery of that license, foreclosure, whatever you want to call it, that then the SBA would then be the owner of a license issued by the FCC. I think if we take a hard look at that scenario and throw a little support behind SBA, who's not been the most successful entity for many of us in small businesses, and if somehow we can blend an intergovernmental discussion to allow for there to be some form of guarantee to a loan for minorities and women-owned businesses who are licensees, of course, that may be a little step outside of the traditional way of thinking and the way government has run in the past.
On a related point, private equity. Terry Jones sat on a panel here not too long ago. CEO of CENTCOM had indicated was heavily invested in broadcast properties years ago and stated pretty squarely that he no longer does. Is it a trickle effect? What if we sort of push some of the measures that you're suggesting? Will that be a part of attracting private equity funds back, or is that money just gone?
Well, let's prepare, if you will, for a moment, a model or a case to a bank. All right. Now, if they're able to get a certain percentage guaranteed, the other side of that is how are they going to get paid back? Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things that Congresswoman Maxine Waters has been proposing, based on some discussions I've had with her, is let's take a look at the dollars spent in broadcast media by the federal government, whether it's the Army, the Navy, or anyone else. There's a large, there's a very significant amount of money spent in the advertising space with TV and radio. The question is, could you begin to create an interagency relationship that would, for lack of better terms, create a set-aside that would allow for dollars to be spent with your licensees who happen to be minority or women, and that then will create the some of the support that you need to build your case before a bank or private investors. Because if they can see that there's a reasonable cash flow, you're buying a station that is underwater, and it's underwater because it hasn't been able to sell or do a good job of bringing revenue in. But if you could create this new, unusual stream of revenue through government purchases into that licensee upon acquisition, or for those of us who are still out here trying to make it, to give us that type of shot in the arm, I think it could be quite rewarding, and it could take you down the path of being able to get the financing that you needed because you'll show the revenue potential to pay off the debt.
Okay. Any other comments on that, David? I'm sorry.
I just want to add that there is no financing for small businesses, so that alone, the broadcast industry. It's so frustrating for small businesses. They create an ARC business, the ARC loans, then businesses goes in there, banks are not participating. So I have a recommendation that we should get some of that stimulus money. President Obama allocated billions on new energy programs, education programs, and other programs of high priority. We should think of $1 billion program that encourages venture capital.
Most of the initiatives the Commission could and should undertake don't happen to be before the Commission in this docket. But that doesn't mean that they're not important. In this docket, there really are two things, which we've spoken of already. One of them being, this long-standing proposal for incubators and waivers, that maybe the 20th year will be the charm. And the other is the foreign ownership rules. We've seen some bump up from the relaxation of EDP 2 years ago, but people ought to remember that much of the culture we have in this country is world culture now. There are great opportunities for American broadcasters, and especially minority broadcasters, to develop platforms overseas, but they can't do that because of what we all know is called reciprocity. Since we have these restrictions on their investors and their banks and their operators getting in here, they impose commensurate restrictions on us. And the way to get them to relax those restrictions so that American broadcasters can grow overseas is for us to come to them and relax our rules too. Keep in mind, when 310b4 was enacted in the earlier version in 1912, we were perhaps understandably afraid that the Kaiser was going to come in and control our new radio business. Right now, we have the most secure, powerful radio and television business in the world. There's no chance whatsoever that foreign governments are going to come in and take over our media. It's absurd. That justification went out the window 50 years ago. And yet there's still someone that will always fear that we're going to have, I don't know, what xenophobia or whatever, but we ought to just call it what it is and say it's more important now to just stand up and say, we've got to give our entrepreneurs access to foreign markets. We've got to give people who want to write checks from overseas to here to help our broadcasters grow to do that. We just have to stand up and have some backbone and say that. Look, we've lost 50% of minority-owned television stations in just the last 10 years, since the duopoly changes in 1999. We've lost 9% of commercial minority-owned radio in just the last 2 years. Who's going to turn the lights out when the last minority broadcaster leaves the room unless we do something urgently about it right now?
Let me just add, I like the concept of the stimulus money, so I'm going to suggest a route for you. Establish about $1 billion fund, place it in the hands of community banks, and earmark it for minority and women-owned acquisitions or expansion of current existing FCC licenses.
I know you guys have been listening to my voice a lot. I've got no questions from the audience, but if I think somebody's going to be coming around with cards, and we can have those questions issued. You just let them know, put your name on it as well. So, and I think Jennifer has a couple questions. I just want to remind folks that you can. Well, oh, okay. Well, then jump on in. Oh, hold on one second. We want to get you a microphone so we can make sure it's on the record. I don't know that's probably why we need the cards, because we need it on the record.
We can repeat it. Go ahead and ask, and we'll just.
Well, we'll just repeat it.
I wanted to make a comment in response to Tom's question about how foreign ownership restrictions.
He's got a mic here.
Okay, go ahead.
Go ahead.
The question you raised was, what would be one of the steps that could be taken to increase the flow of capital? I'm an attorney in private practice. I represent the two largest Spanish language media companies in the world, one's based in Mexico, one's based in Spain. And I can tell you for a fact that the greatest hindrance to their ability to invest in radio and television in this country is the foreign ownership. Because, one, they've got to find an eligible partner first. That partner has to be consonant with them in terms of the long-term plans. And then they have to work out very convoluted economic arrangements in order to make sure that their return on investment is reasonable. There's no logical reason or political reason, as pointed out, to retain a limit on foreign ownership when the president has the right to take over any property he wants in the event of a war. And that was the reason for these rules to begin with. And I think that the Commission should finally really sit down and take a look as to whether this last restriction on the broadcast industry, because it's basically been eviscerated for all other reasons. So the Germans own T-Mobile, and a foreign company could come in tomorrow and own AT&T or Verizon, and there's basically very little the Commission would do about it, because you've already indicated the presumption is there's no reason not to allow foreign investment. So my question basically is, why can't the Commission finally take a look at this issue once and for all in the aftermath of Mr. Murdoch several years ago?
Okay. Well, at least we got the full question on record, so thoughts?
Well, I sure agree. And you saw when Norman Leventhal is a hero of mine. He's virtually alone in the wilderness, fought this issue for 20 years. Thank you, Norman. You were always right.
Well, I might be changing the subject now. I wanted to ask a question about the rules at issue in the proceeding that we're talking about today. We have 5 specific media ownership rules that we're considering in the proceeding. I wondered if there were any in particular that you thought were more tied to our diversity goal or less so, any that you were more concerned about either loosening or tightening as it relates to diversity. In other words, I'm just trying to get at the specifics. Are there any of the rules in particular that you're concerned about?
I'm sorry, could you state the rules?
I could give it a shot.
I'll try to answer it.
Okay. Local television ownership rule, local radio ownership rule, radio television cross ownership rule, newspaper, broadcast, cross-ownership rule, and dual network rule.
Well, because I own a radio station and a TV station, I support that in the same market. But there are some real challenges, as David points out, and we at NABOB point out, and that is when you have one person owning a variety, or one entity owning many, many radio stations, the economic issue there, it's not the ownership, it's the fact that there's a critical mass and their salespeople can go and sell several different stations and different programs at one time, and then they end up acquiring the lion's share of the advertising because it's sort of a one-stop shop. Now, unless the minority firm has the same, can play in the same garden, you're not going to have them succeed very well. And so I think we have to look very carefully at how. I'm not suggesting we necessarily unravel it, but I think that there are enough small onesie-twosie type radio stations that are out here that probably the commission should bring them in. As I said in my opening remarks, I speak more anecdotally, so I'm not going to necessarily speak to the rules per se, but I can speak to the effect of your decisions and what that's actually done to a businessman like myself. And I think more businessmen at these roundtables who are actually living and breathing this issue on a daily basis would perhaps be very helpful to responding to those changes.
The dual network rule, the cross-ownership rule, the local radio rule, and the local television rule, we do not support any further deregulation of those, except to the extent that in a particular instance, a waiver around the edges coupled with an incubation that has greater public interest value than you might lose through the waiver might be in the public interest, and the commission should open its mind to that. We have done something that could get me in trouble, which is we have abandoned our opposition to newspaper broadcast cross-ownership. And the reason is that we're facing the very quick demise of a vital institution. It may or may not be the fact that this one rule, which has, fortunately, relatively limited impact in terms of the number of owners in a market, may or may not influence whether certain newspapers get saved or local journalism gets saved. But it could. And that's such a vital element of our democracy that it just seemed to us like a small thing to give up in order to do our part to save it. And it was tough because we'd fought this for years. But it's just more important to leave no stone unturned to save print journalism.
Can I just add something on the ethnic media, the print, how important that is? We noticed that, you know, the ads are always just put on the main street media, like, you know, the Wall Street, New York Times, LA. But then they forget the ethnic media that's really being read by the minority majority in California, for example. And I would really encourage FCC to consider the ethnic media. It's being forgotten, and yet it's widely read. All those issues that we have, if they just print it on the Vietnamese, the Korean newspaper, the Filipino newspaper, I think it will make a big difference.
I'm sorry, go ahead. I was just going to say, I just want to add that, you know, from AWRT's perspective, we just ask that the commission really weigh the cause and effect of any changes to the rules or even in maintaining the rules. Because even maintaining the current rules may have a positive effect or a detrimental effect on the opportunities for women and minorities in the media. And certainly, if there's a chance to take scope into account, when you're talking about a large media player that already controls a significant part of the market, further controlling the news for a big city, it's very different than somebody that owns a station or a couple stations in a much more rural area that's just trying to stay afloat and realize some economies of scale and continue to provide at least a basic service to that market.
Just a quick follow-up on newspaper broadcast cross-ownership rule. Is your change in position mean no restrictions at all, or do you support something in between what we have now and nothing at all, no ban at all?
We haven't gotten quite that granular on it. Certainly we wouldn't want a newspaper owner like anyone else to be able to own more than the number of stations now allowed that anyone else can own in a local market. But we haven't continued to oppose a newspaper being treated like any other applicant that wants to own local media. And again, I'll tell you, that was tough, but you know, sometimes you have to weigh things, and sometimes things are just more important than ideals that you've held for years and years.
We're coming up on the close of the hour, but I've got a question from the audience, and I'm going to sort of ask everyone to kind of give me your closing comments, and in that I'd like to hear what questions you think we ought to be asking. But before I get to that, let me read this question. It says, in working with recent immigrants applying for radio stations, the boards of directors sometimes do not meet the 75% citizen requirement for ownership. Recent immigrants have not always completed the tortuous path to full citizenship. Should the FCC consider lowering this barrier for U.S. residents who are not yet citizens?
Can I ask Norman to answer that? Yes.
I think you should lower it for anybody. I mean, the whole concept of this country is built on free speech. And what I wanted to really emphasize before is that the single greatest factor in raising capital for investment in media is loosening or eliminating the foreign ownership rules. There is no question in my mind that my two clients would be investing heavily here if those rules weren't in effect.
Okay, thank you. Last comments, and as I said, part of that would like to hear, as part of this review process for us, what questions you think we should be looking at specific to female and minority ownership. Maybe we can go in order. Faith, do you have last comments?
Me, there's got to be a good percentage of minority female ownership. And if you do not have that, if you have not met that, allow this media to give 30% of their contracts to minority female businesses.
I think the single greatest thing the Commission could do in the short run would be just to clean up its docket. It's now January 27th, 2010. If the Commission in just 2 months could use that time, those 9 weeks, to just pull together those who have been proponents, those who are experts on, and those who are going to be affected by any of the 40 or so pending proposals, some large, some small, but the small ones mean a lot to the few people that they can affect. The scale of an idea is not a reason to deny the idea, and the controversiality of an idea is not a reason to deny it if it's a good idea. And aggregate those, not just 2 or 3, but everything that can help. We don't tell carriers that we're only going to do 2 or 3 things when it comes to inter-carrier comp this year. We look at those things holistically because we see them as priorities. Maybe out of 40 things, there are 20 that ought to be done now. Figure out what those are. Get them in a report and order to circulate in the 8th floor in just 2 months, and then let the Commission vote. And make sure that when it does, someone has thought ahead to what kind of money is going to be necessary to enforce and apply these rules, so we don't have the specter of the adoption of 13 proposals, good ones. In December 2007, we're still waiting for the most important ones to be enforced. It's that simple. Oh, and get rid of the foreign ownership rule.
Well, I'm going to tie in, since so many other my colleagues so eloquently put the issues forth. I'll double back just for a moment. Questions: can you create a more interagency game plan to help the economics of the current licensees and potential licensees? That would require you to speak with Treasury, Commerce, and SBA specific. How do you communicate with them, or do you continue to stay isolated? Do you work with minority business development agencies, David Henson over at Commerce, to see what they're doing in the area of trying to build broadcast opportunities? Are you blending your ideas with the agencies and then the White House? Look, I'm out here every day working. My brother and I have built these companies. We've owned as many as 15 TV stations, and we have radio stations. We've sold them. We've moved them. We've been involved in, as you know, digital. We own digital licenses. And now we're engaged in the broadband side as an applicant. And I understand the first round there were no minorities selected in any of the applicants for broadband that's just coming out this week. So, you know, there are a lot of challenges, and you need to be a voice to these other agencies. You know, I saw the movie Invictus the other day, and I realized that back when I was pledging my fraternity, Kappa Alpha Psi, that was one of the poems that we had to memorize. And sometimes when I'm dealing with my, the programmers that are beating up on us, like, 20th Century Fox and Sony, who will go out and sue you if you're a day late, whereas other programmers don't. They work with you. They blend their ideas with you. We're fighting every day, and it's all of the challenges that you hear about plus. Because you also have your employee issues. I mean, it goes on and on and on. As an entrepreneur and a business person, as a capitalist, as I said earlier, like in the words of Invictus, my head may be bloody, but it is unbowed.
I'd just like to say, one, thank you to the Commission for giving all of us today and over the last few weeks the opportunity to really come in and talk about ideas and suggestions we have for improving the opportunities for women and minorities owning stations. Just in conclusion, we've all talked about the barriers to entry for women and minorities in acquiring broadcast facilities. And I would just like to say that as the FCC considers rule changes, policy changes, and possibly recommended new business practices, that it really focus on just a couple of key suggestions and recommendations, something that we can really go out and we can implement, so that when we regroup 3 to 5 years from now, we have measurable, and that is measurable, positive changes where women and minorities are concerned with ownership of broadcast stations.
Well, thank you all for your comments, for your thoughts, for your questions. We are now at the close of our hour. Bill, if you want to close us out.
Yes, as we close, we have a question about whether we have any plans for field hearings. We're very appreciative of the willingness of our panelists to come to us from various parts of the country and share their views with us, and this has been extremely useful. The recording of this proceeding will be part of our record in our ownership review proceeding. We also do plan to have field hearings. We want to go out and hear from people in other communities, and we will be announcing the first field hearing very shortly. Thank you again for a very useful morning. Thank you very much. Bye.